Hello guys. Have you ever stopped to think about where the tradition of setting up nativity scenes at Christmas came from? How did this idea of creating small dioramas representing such an ancient scene originate? In this video, you will embark on a fascinating journey through the centuries, exploring how artisans, artists, and ordinary people transformed a simple idea into one of the most enduring traditions in the Western world. You'll learn about the challenges they faced, the materials they used, and how these representations evolved from simple live enactments into true works of art. If you stay until the end, you'll understand not only the history of nativity scenes, but also what they reveal about our human need to make stories visible, tangible, real. So find a comfortable position, adjust your pillows, turn off the lights if you prefer, and let this story carry you through time. Let's begin our journey on a cold winter night, more than 800 years ago. It was the year 1223 and winter blanketed the hills of central Italy in a frosty cloak. In the small town of Greccio, nestled among mountains, people lived simple lives marked by the rhythm of seasons and the teachings of the church. Most could not read or write. The stories of faith reached them through words spoken by priests, through songs, through images painted on church walls. But one man, Francis of Assisi, had a different vision. Francis was already known throughout the region as a holy man who had renounced wealth to live in poverty and preach love for all God's creatures. That year, as Christmas approached, he had an idea that would change how future generations would experience this celebration. He wanted people to truly understand the nativity story, not just hear it, but see it, feel it, experience it with all their senses. Francis chose a natural grotto on a mountainside near Greccio. He asked a local nobleman, Giovanni Vellita, to help prepare something special for Christmas Eve. Together they gathered straw and placed it in a stone manger. They brought a live ox and donkey. As night fell on December 24th, people from Greccio and surrounding villages began climbing the mountain trail, carrying torches that flickered in the cold darkness. When they arrived at the grotto, they found something they had never seen before. There, in the dim torchlight, was a living representation of the Nativity. Real animals breathed warm clouds into the cold air. Fresh straw filled the space with its earthy scent. Francis himself celebrated Mass in that improvised stable, and for the first time those simple people could see, smell, and almost touch the scene they had only heard described in words. Imagine being there that night, the cold biting your face as you climbed the mountain. The golden light of torches creating dancing shadows on rock walls. The sound of animals shifting in the straw. The smell of hay mixed with wood smoke. And in the center of it all, a scene that made an ancient story suddenly real, immediate, present. This was revolutionary. Until that moment, religious stories existed primarily in the abstract realm of words and stylized images. But Francis understood something profound about human nature. We learn best when multiple senses are engaged. We connect more deeply with stories we can experience, not just hear. The people of Greccio were moved in ways words alone had never achieved. They didn't just understand the nativity story intellectually, they felt it. The cold of that winter night connected them to the cold of Bethlehem. The humble grotto echoed the humble stable. The real animals brought life and authenticity to a scene that had always been distant and abstract. And before we continue, we want to extend a special invitation. If you're enjoying this journey through history, help our community grow. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss the next stories we'll share. And tell us, where are you watching from now? What time is it there? It's fascinating for us to know that our community is spread across the world in different time zones, but all connected by these stories. Leave a comment sharing your location. We'd love to know where you are. News of what happened in Greccio spread slowly but persistently. Travelers carried the story to distant cities. Monks wrote about it in chronicles, and gradually others began to create their own representations. But this evolution was neither easy nor quick. Remember, this was a time without instant communication, without printing presses, without means of reproducing images. An idea could only spread through people telling other people, who then had to try to recreate something they had never seen based only on verbal descriptions. Each person who tried to recreate the idea inevitably added their own interpretations, adapted to available materials, adjusted according to local traditions. In warmer regions, keeping live animals inside a church was impractical. In poorer areas, there were no resources for elaborate setups. Some communities faced resistance from religious authorities who viewed the innovation with suspicion. But the idea had a force of its own. It responded to a fundamental human need, and so it continued to spread, adapt, and evolve. Think of the courage required to be among the first to adopt this new tradition. You would be doing something your parents and grandparents never did. You would be investing time and resources in something with no guarantee of acceptance. You would be risking criticism from authorities who might view your innovation as inappropriate. And yet people did it. Throughout Italy and eventually beyond, people decided the idea was worth the risk. Why? Because that first experience in Greccio had proven something important. Making stories visible and tangible had a power that words alone could not achieve. As the 13th century progressed, the tradition began transitioning from live representations to sculpted figures. This shift was practical. You couldn't keep live animals and people in position indefinitely, but it also opened new creative possibilities. Artisans could now craft permanent figures, refining details, creating expressions, designing poses that captured specific moments in the narrative. The earliest figures were simple, carved from local wood or molded from clay. Artisans worked with basic tools and limited materials, yet they poured remarkable care into their creations. Each figure was unique, shaped by the individual craftsman's skill and vision. There was no mass production, no standardization. Every nativity scene was a singular work, reflecting the particular talents and resources of its maker. These early artisans faced significant challenges. How do you carve a face that conveys both humility and divinity? How do you create clothing that looks realistic in miniature? How do you position figures so they tell a story even when static? These were new problems requiring new solutions. And slowly, through trial and experimentation, techniques developed. Some artisans specialized in carving wood, learning to work with the grain to create flowing robes and expressive faces. Others mastered terracotta, discovering how to mold clay into delicate forms that could be fired and painted. The most skilled could create figures with movable parts, arms that could be positioned, heads that could turn, allowing for different arrangements and interpretations. As these representations moved from grottos into churches, they became more elaborate. Churches had more space, more resources, and often more ambitious visions. Some created permanent installations inside chapels. Others designed portable scenes that could be assembled each Christmas season. The best examples became destinations, drawing visitors from surrounding regions who wanted to see these remarkable creations. Different regions developed distinctive styles. In Naples, nativity scenes became extraordinarily elaborate, with dozens or even hundreds of figures depicting not just the Holy Family, but entire villages with merchants, shepherds, musicians, and townspeople going about daily life. These Neapolitan scenes reflected the vibrant, crowded streets of Naples itself, transforming the ancient story into something that felt contemporary and local. In Provence, the tradition took a different form. The santons, little saints, were smaller, simpler figures, often depicting local characters and professions. A Provençal nativity might include a baker, a fisherman, a lavender seller, all dressed in regional costume, all bringing their gifts to the Christ child. This localization made the story feel immediate and relevant to ordinary people's lives. In Spain, particularly in Catalonia, nativity scenes incorporated unique elements reflecting local culture. These regional variations show how the tradition adapted to different cultural contexts while maintaining its core purpose. As nativity scenes spread beyond Italy, they encountered different climates, materials, and artistic traditions. In Germany, artisans used abundant local forests to create intricate wooden figures and elaborate stable structures. In Poland, scenes might be set in landscapes of snow and pine, reflecting the local winter environment. In Latin America, indigenous artisans incorporated native materials and artistic styles, creating vibrant, colorful interpretations that blended European tradition with local aesthetics. This cultural adaptation was crucial to the tradition's survival and spread. A nativity scene wasn't imposed as a foreign custom but rather adopted and transformed to reflect local identity. People saw their own world reflected in these scenes, their architecture, their clothing, their landscape, their daily life. This made the ancient story feel not distant and foreign, but close and personal. By the 15th and 16th centuries, nativity scenes had evolved from simple church displays into sophisticated art forms. Wealthy families commissioned elaborate private scenes, competing to create the most impressive displays. Master artisans developed reputations for their skill, and their works were sought after and treasured. These artisans often worked in family workshops, passing techniques from generation to generation. A master would train apprentices in the careful work of carving, molding, painting, and assembling. The knowledge was practical and hands-on. You learned by watching, by doing, by making mistakes, and correcting them under the master's guidance. The creation of a single high-quality figure could take weeks. The artisan would select the right piece of wood, studying its grain and character. Then came the careful carving, removing material bit by bit to reveal the form within. Features were refined with increasingly delicate tools. The figure was sanded smooth, then treated to prevent cracking. Finally came painting, layers of color applied with precision to create realistic skin tones, detailed clothing, expressive faces. For terracotta figures, the process was different but equally demanding. The artisan would model the figure in clay, capturing gesture and expression while the material was still soft. Once the form was complete, it had to dry slowly and evenly to prevent cracking. Then came firing in a kiln, a delicate process where temperature had to be carefully controlled. After firing, the figure was painted, often with multiple layers to achieve depth and realism. The finest figures had glass eyes that caught the light, creating an uncanny sense of life. Some had real hair, carefully attached, strand by strand. Clothing might be actual fabric, cut and sewn in miniature, or painted with such skill that it appeared three-dimensional. But nativity scenes were more than just collections of beautiful figures. They were complete environments, carefully designed to tell a story and create an atmosphere. The stable or grotto had to be constructed, often with remarkable attention to architectural detail. Landscapes were created with moss, stones, and miniature plants. Lighting was carefully considered. Where would candles or lamps be placed to create the most effective illumination? Some scenes incorporated moving elements, water that actually flowed in a tiny stream, windmills with turning blades, figures that could be repositioned to show different moments in the narrative. These mechanical elements added wonder and delight, especially for children who might spend long minutes watching water flow or a wheel turn. As nativity scenes became more common in private homes, they also became more personal. Families developed their own traditions about when and how to set up the scene. Some made it a solemn ritual on Christmas Eve. Others created it gradually throughout Advent, adding figures day by day. Children might be given the honor of placing the infant Jesus in the manger at midnight on Christmas Eve. These family traditions created powerful memories and emotional connections. Adults would remember helping their parents or grandparents set up the nativity scene when they were children. They would recall the excitement of unwrapping each figure from its careful storage, the satisfaction of arranging the scene just right, the quiet moment when the final piece was placed and the scene was complete. Francis of Assisi died in 1226, just 3 years after creating that first representation in Greccio. He did not live to see how far his simple idea would spread, how many different forms it would take, how many centuries it would endure. But he had planted a seed that would continue to grow in ways he never could have imagined. In that cold grotto on an Italian mountain, illuminated only by flickering torches, with the smell of straw and animals in the air, something new had been born. Not just a specific tradition, but a deeper understanding of how to communicate, how to teach, how to connect people with stories and ideas. As you lie now, comfortably, perhaps with your eyes closed, think of that first night. Imagine the cold air, the golden light of the torches, the smell of fresh straw. Imagine the people climbing that mountain trail, curious, hopeful, open to something new. Imagine the surprise when they saw that scene for the first time, the moment when something that had always been just words suddenly became real before their eyes. And it all began in a simple grotto on a cold winter night, more than 800 years ago. The transformation of nativity scenes from living tableau to permanent sculptural works required artisans to master new materials and develop innovative techniques. This chapter explores the practical challenges these craftsmen faced and the creative solutions they discovered. Understanding these processes helps us appreciate the skill, patience, and artistry that went into creating even the simplest figure. Wood was often the first choice for early nativity figures, particularly in regions where forests were abundant. But not just any wood would do. Artisans learned through experience which types worked best for different purposes. Lime wood, with its fine, even grain, was prized for detailed carving. It was soft enough to work relatively easily, yet strong enough to hold fine details without splintering. Oak, harder and more durable, was better suited for structural elements, the stable, the manger, supporting frameworks. The artisan would begin by selecting a piece of wood, examining it carefully for flaws, knots, or irregularities in the grain. A single hidden defect could ruin weeks of work if it appeared only after carving had begun. Once selected, the wood needed to be properly seasoned, dried slowly over months or even years to prevent warping or cracking later. Carving began with rough work, removing large amounts of material to establish the basic form. The artisan used axes, adzes, and large chisels, working with bold, confident strokes. This phase required both strength and vision, the ability to see the finished figure hidden within the raw block of wood. As the form emerged, tools became progressively smaller and more delicate. Medium chisels refined the proportions. Small gouges carved the folds of clothing. Tiny V-tools incised fine details, the lines of a face, the texture of hair, the decorative elements of garments. The finest work required tools no larger than a pencil, guided with precision measured in fractions of millimeters. The carving of a face was particularly challenging. Too much removed from a cheek, and the expression changed entirely. Eyes had to be positioned exactly right, slightly too far apart, and the figure looked strange, too close, and it appeared tense or angry. Mouths were especially difficult. A smile could easily become a grimace if the curve wasn't precisely right. Experienced artisans developed an intimate understanding of how wood behaved. They learned to work with the grain, not against it. They knew which cuts would split the wood and which would slice cleanly. They understood how different woods responded to tools. Some carved like butter, others required patience and persistence. After carving came the delicate work of smoothing. Rough surfaces were abraded with progressively finer materials, coarse sand, fine sand, dried horsetail plants whose silica content made them natural sandpaper. The goal was a surface so smooth that it seemed to glow, ready to receive paint or stain. But wood had limitations. It was difficult to achieve certain effects. The delicate fingers of praying hands, the fine features of an infant's face, the flowing folds of elaborate drapery. For these challenges, artisans turned to clay. Clay offered remarkable versatility. While soft, it could be shaped with infinite subtlety, capturing nuances impossible in wood. Fingers could model forms directly, feeling the shapes emerge. Simple tools, wooden sticks, wire loops, pieces of cloth, could create textures and details of extraordinary refinement. The clay used for nativity figures was typically terracotta, literally baked earth, a reddish clay that fired to a warm, earthy color. Artisans learned to prepare their clay carefully, removing stones and impurities, kneading it to achieve consistent texture, adding water to reach the perfect working consistency, soft enough to shape easily, firm enough to hold details. Modeling began with a basic armature, often just a simple wooden stake, around which the clay was built up. The artisan worked from large forms to small details, constantly stepping back to view the figure from different angles, checking proportions, adjusting poses. Unlike wood carving, where material removed was gone forever, clay remained forgiving. You could add more, reshape, start over if necessary. The modeling of clothing was particularly important. Artisans learned to create fabric that looked soft and natural, with folds that followed the body's form and movement. They studied how real cloth draped and hung, then translated those observations into clay. A shepherd's rough tunic fell differently than a king's rich robe. A cloak caught by wind showed different folds than one hanging still. Hands were always challenging. The human hand is remarkably expressive, and getting it right required careful observation and practice. Artisans learned the proportions, the length of fingers relative to the palm, the way joints bent, how hands looked in different positions. A hand holding a staff, offering a gift, raised in blessing, each required different treatment. Once modeling was complete, the figure entered its most vulnerable phase, drying. This had to happen slowly and evenly. If the surface dried too quickly while the interior remained wet, the figure would crack. Artisans learned to dry their work gradually, sometimes covering it with damp cloths, controlling the environment, checking constantly for signs of problems. When fully dry, the figure was ready for firing. This was perhaps the most nerve-wracking moment in the entire process. Weeks of careful work could be destroyed in the kiln if temperatures weren't controlled precisely. The kiln had to be heated gradually, allowing remaining moisture to escape without causing steam explosions. Then came the high-temperature firing that transformed soft clay into hard ceramic. Finally, cooling had to be equally gradual, too fast, and thermal shock could crack the piece. Successful firing was almost magical. The figure that emerged from the kiln was transformed, harder, more durable, ready to last for generations. But it was also fragile in new ways. A blow that would merely dent wood could shatter fired clay. Artisans had to handle their creations with constant care. After firing came painting, a process requiring different skills entirely. The painter needed understanding of color, light, and the optical effects of layered pigments. The goal was to bring the figure to life, to transform a monochrome ceramic form into something that appeared real. Painting began with a base layer, often a gesso, a mixture of chalk and glue, that provided a smooth, white surface. This base was crucial, as it affected how all subsequent colors appeared. Once dry, the gesso was lightly sanded to perfect smoothness. Then came the careful application of paint. Artisans used pigments derived from natural sources, earth colors from various clays and minerals, blues from lapis lazuli or azurite, reds from cinnabar or madder root, greens from malachite or verdigris. These pigments were ground to fine powder and mixed with binding media, egg tempera, oil, or various varnishes. Skin tones were built up in layers, starting with base colors and adding highlights and shadows to create the illusion of three-dimensional form. The painter had to understand how light would fall on the figure, where shadows would naturally occur, how to suggest the subtle color variations of real skin. Eyes were particularly important. They could make or break a figure's expressiveness. Some artisans painted eyes with remarkable skill, creating the illusion of depth and life. The finest figures had eyes of glass, carefully set into the clay before firing, that caught and reflected light like real eyes. Clothing received equally careful attention. The painter had to suggest not just color but texture, the roughness of homespun wool, the smoothness of silk, the metallic sheen of brocade. Patterns and decorations were added with tiny brushes, sometimes single hairs wide, allowing details of extraordinary fineness. Some artisans specialized in particular aspects of the work. One might be known for carving faces, another for modeling hands, a third for painting. Workshops often divided labor, with different specialists contributing to each figure. This allowed for higher quality but required careful coordination to maintain consistency of style. The finest workshops developed signature styles that became recognizable. Collectors learned to identify work from particular masters or regions. A Neapolitan figure had different proportions and style than one from Provence or Bavaria. These regional characteristics reflected not just artistic preferences but also the materials available, the techniques taught, and the cultural context in which the artisans worked. Beyond wood and terracotta, artisans experimented with other materials. In some regions, figures were carved from ivory, though this was expensive and reserved for the wealthiest patrons. Stone was occasionally used, particularly for architectural elements. Wax allowed for incredibly detailed modeling, but was fragile and sensitive to heat. Some of the most elaborate figures combined multiple materials. A wooden body might have hands and face of terracotta for finer detail. Clothing might be actual fabric, carefully cut and sewn in miniature, stiffened with glue to hold its shape. Hair might be real, attached strand by strand. Eyes of glass, jewelry of metal, tiny props of various materials, all contributed to the figure's realism and impact. The creation of a complete nativity scene required more than just figures. The setting was equally important. Artisans constructed stables and grottos with remarkable attention to architectural detail. They studied real buildings, understanding how stone was laid, how wood was joined, how roofs were constructed. Then they recreated these structures in miniature, often with working doors, removable roofs, and interior details. Landscapes were created with various materials. Moss, carefully preserved, became grass and ground cover. Small stones suggested rocky terrain. Bits of mirror created pools or streams. Cork, with its rough texture, was perfect for suggesting rocky cliffs or cave walls. Dried plants and twigs became miniature trees and bushes. Some artisans created remarkably sophisticated mechanical elements. Water could be made to flow using simple pumps or gravity-fed systems. Windmills could turn, powered by clockwork mechanisms or falling weights. Figures could be made to move, shepherds walking, angels descending, magi processing, through clever use of cams, levers, and hidden mechanisms. These moving elements required skills beyond sculpture and painting. The artisan needed understanding of mechanics, of how to create reliable motion from simple components. Everything had to be robust enough to function repeatedly, yet delicate enough to maintain the scene's scale and aesthetic. As you rest now, imagine the workshop of a master artisan, the smell of wood shavings and linseed oil, the sound of chisel on wood, the scrape of tools shaping clay, the sight of figures in various stages of completion, rough forms, detailed carvings, painted pieces awaiting final touches, the patient, methodical work, day after day, transforming raw materials into objects of beauty and meaning. In this careful, deliberate process, something remarkable was happening. Ordinary materials were being transformed into vessels of story and tradition. If there is one city that can claim to be the true capital of nativity scene tradition, it is Naples. In this vibrant, chaotic, passionate city on the southern coast of Italy, the art of creating presepios, as nativity scenes are called in Italian, reached heights of complexity, artistry, and cultural significance found nowhere else. To understand Naples' relationship with nativity scenes is to understand something essential about the city itself, its character, its values, its way of seeing the world. Naples in the 17th and 18th centuries was a city of extraordinary contrasts. It was one of the largest cities in Europe, rivaling Paris and London in population. Its streets teemed with life, merchants hawking goods, nobles in elaborate carriages, priests and monks, beggars and street performers, fishermen bringing their catch from the harbour, craftsmen working in open-air workshops. The city was crowded, noisy, colourful, intense, a sensory overload of sights, sounds and smells. The Neapolitan people had a particular genius for drama, for spectacle, for making the ordinary extraordinary. This theatrical sensibility permeated every aspect of life, from religious processions to daily interactions in the marketplace. It was perhaps inevitable that when this culture embraced the nativity scene tradition, it would transform it into something uniquely elaborate and expressive. The Neapolitan presepio was not a simple representation of the Holy Family in a stable. It was an entire world, a complete universe in miniature. The most elaborate scenes contained hundreds of figures, not just the traditional characters of the nativity story, but representations of every aspect of Neapolitan life. There were fishermen and farmers, bakers and butchers, nobles and beggars, musicians and dancers, tavern keepers and their customers, women washing clothes, children playing, dogs sleeping in the sun. This expansion of the traditional scene had profound meaning. The Neapolitans were saying that the sacred story was not separate from ordinary life, but deeply embedded in it. The birth of the Christ child happened not in some distant, abstract holy space, but in the midst of real human activity, among real people going about their daily business. By placing contemporary Neapolitan characters in the ancient scene, artisans were making a theological statement. This story is not just about the past. It is about now, about us, about our world. The creation of these elaborate scenes became a major industry in Naples. Entire streets were devoted to workshops producing presepio figures and accessories. The most famous was, and still is, the Via San Gregorio Armeno, a narrow street in the historic center of Naples that has been associated with presepio artisans for centuries. Walking down this street, especially in the weeks before Christmas, is an overwhelming experience. Every shop overflows with figures, settings, accessories. The variety is astonishing. Every possible character, every imaginable detail, from the sublime to the ridiculous. Neapolitan presepio figures developed a distinctive style. They were typically built on a wire armature that allowed for flexible positioning. The body was often simple, made of tow or hemp, wrapped around the wire frame. But the head, hands, and feet were crafted with extraordinary care, usually in terracotta, modelled and painted with remarkable skill. The figures were then dressed in actual fabric clothing, carefully sewn in miniature, using materials appropriate to each character's social station: rough cloth for peasants, fine silk for nobles, elaborate brocades for the magi. The attention to detail in these costumes was remarkable. A nobleman's jacket might have tiny functioning buttons, a woman's dress might have multiple layers: chemise, underskirt, overskirt, apron, each properly constructed. Hats, shoes, jewelry, tools, weapons, every accessory was crafted with the same meticulous care. Some figures carried baskets filled with miniature food, tiny loaves of bread, fish, vegetables, all sculpted and painted with astonishing realism. The artisans who created these figures were organized into guilds with strict hierarchies and traditions. A master artisan might specialize in one particular aspect: heads, hands, clothing, or accessories. The most respected masters became famous, their work sought after by wealthy collectors. Some families maintained workshops for generations, passing down techniques and secrets from father to son, mother to daughter. The creation of a single high-quality figure was a lengthy process. The head would be modeled in clay, capturing not just features but expression and character. Each figure had a personality. You could see it in the tilt of the head, the expression of the face, the gesture of the hands. After modeling came firing, then painting with multiple layers to achieve realistic skin tones and expressive eyes. Glass eyes were often inserted for the most important figures, creating an uncanny sense of life. The bodies, though simpler than the heads, still required skill to construct. The wire armature had to be shaped to suggest the figure's pose and proportions. The padding had to be applied evenly, creating a form that would look natural once clothed. The hands and feet, like the head, were usually terracotta, carefully modeled to show age, work, character. A shepherd's rough, weathered hands were different from a noble's soft, elegant ones. Clothing the figures was an art in itself. The seamstress, and this work was often done by women, had to understand not just sewing but also historical costume, social distinctions, and the way fabric behaved at miniature scale. Some fabrics worked well in miniature, others looked wrong no matter how carefully sewn. The best costumers learned which materials to use for different effects, how to create the illusion of weight and drape, how to suggest texture and richness. But the figures were only the beginning. A complete Neapolitan presepio required an elaborate setting. The traditional form was a multi-level landscape, often built into a corner of a room or a large cabinet. The upper levels typically showed the countryside, hills, rocky outcrops, caves, distant villages. The middle levels contained the stable or grotto where the Holy Family resided, surrounded by shepherds and animals. The lower levels depicted the town, streets, shops, taverns, houses, all populated with figures going about daily activities. Creating these landscapes required different skills. Artisans built frameworks of wood, then covered them with materials that suggested terrain: papier-mâché molded into hills and valleys, cork for rocky cliffs, plaster for architectural elements. Moss became grass and ground cover. Small stones suggested rocky terrain. Miniature plants, carefully preserved or crafted, became trees and bushes. Bits of mirror created pools or streams, catching candlelight to suggest water. The architectural elements were particularly impressive. Artisans constructed miniature buildings with remarkable accuracy, taverns with tiny tables and chairs, shops with miniature goods displayed, houses with multiple rooms visible through windows or removable walls. Some buildings had working doors and shutters. Roofs might be removable, revealing detailed interiors. The level of detail was extraordinary. You could spend hours examining a large presepio and continually discover new elements. Lighting was carefully considered. In the era before electricity, Precipios were illuminated by candles or oil lamps, strategically placed to create dramatic effects. The stable or grotto would be brightly lit, drawing the eye to the central scene. Other areas might be in shadow, with occasional points of light suggesting windows or fires. The interplay of light and shadow added depth and atmosphere, making the scene feel alive and dynamic. Some elaborate precipios incorporated moving elements. Water might flow in a tiny stream, powered by a hidden pump or gravity-fed system. Windmills turned, their blades catching the light. Figures could be made to move along tracks or through simple mechanisms. Shepherds processing toward the stable, angels descending from above, the magi traveling from distant lands. These mechanical elements added wonder and delight, especially for children who might watch for long minutes, mesmerized by the motion. The tradition of the Neapolitan Precipio became deeply embedded in the city's culture. Wealthy families competed to create the most impressive displays, commissioning new figures each year, expanding their scenes, incorporating the latest innovations. The creation and display of the family Precipio became a major event of the Christmas season, with friends and neighbors invited to admire the work. But Precipios were not just for the wealthy. Even modest families created their own scenes, perhaps with just a few simple figures, but assembled with care and love. The important thing was not the expense or elaborateness, but the act of creating the scene, of making the story visible and present in the home. Certain figures became traditional in Neapolitan Precipios, beyond the obvious characters of the Nativity story. Benigno, the sleeping shepherd, appeared in almost every scene, a figure shown sleeping through the miraculous event, representing those who miss the sacred because they are not paying attention. The zampognari, shepherds playing traditional bagpipes, were essential, representing the music and celebration of the season. The benandanti, figures bringing gifts of food and goods, showed the community's response to the holy birth. And then there were the more unusual, even humorous elements that made Neapolitan Precipios distinctive. Tavern scenes might show figures eating, drinking, even arguing. There might be a figure of a man relieving himself, earthy, perhaps crude, but reflecting the Neapolitan insistence that the sacred exists within the real, not separate from it. These elements sometimes scandalized outsiders, but for Neapolitans, they were essential. A reminder that holiness is found in the midst of ordinary, messy, fully human life. The artisans of Via San Gregorio Armeno also created figures representing contemporary people and events. Politicians, celebrities, local characters, all might appear in Precipio form. This tradition continues today, with new figures created each year reflecting current events. It's a way of connecting the ancient story to the present moment, of saying that the themes of the Nativity, hope, renewal, the breaking in of the divine into ordinary life, remain relevant and immediate. The Neapolitan Precipio tradition faced challenges over the centuries. Periods of war, economic hardship, and social change threatened the workshops and the artisans who maintained the tradition. In the 19th century, as Naples was incorporated into the unified Italian state, some feared the tradition would fade. In the 20th century, mass production and changing tastes posed new threats. But the tradition survived, adapted, and even flourished. The artisans of Via San Gregorio Armeno continued their work, maintaining old techniques while also innovating. The street became a tourist destination, attracting visitors from around the world who came to see the incredible variety and artistry of Neapolitan Precipio figures. UNESCO recognized the tradition's cultural significance, helping to ensure its preservation. Today, walking down Via San Gregorio Armeno, especially in the weeks before Christmas, you step into a world where past and present merge. Ancient techniques are still practiced in workshops that have existed for generations, But you also see innovation, new materials, new subjects, new interpretations. The tradition remains alive because it continues to evolve while maintaining its essential character. As you rest now, imagine yourself on that narrow Neapolitan street. The winter sun slants between tall buildings. Every shop window overflows with figures, shepherds and angels, bakers and fishermen, nobles and beggars, all frozen in moments of activity. The air smells of coffee from nearby cafes, of fresh bread from bakeries, of the sea not far away. You hear the musical Neapolitan dialect, animated conversations, laughter. And everywhere, in every shop, in every workshop, the patient work continues. Hands shaping clay, brushes applying paint, needles stitching tiny garments. The ancient story being told again, in new ways, for new generations, in this city that made the Principio tradition uniquely its own. While Naples developed the most elaborate and complex nativity scene tradition, another region of Europe took a very different approach. In Provence, the sunny southeastern region of France, the nativity scene tradition evolved into something simpler, more intimate, yet equally meaningful. The Provençal tradition shows us that beauty and significance don't require complexity or grandeur. Sometimes the most profound expressions are the simplest. Provence is a land of particular character. The landscape is marked by rolling hills covered with lavender, olive groves silvered by the Mediterranean sun, ancient stone villages perched on hilltops, fields of sunflowers turning their faces toward the light. The light itself is special here, clear, golden, beloved by painters who have long been drawn to the region. The pace of life is slower, more connected to the rhythms of agriculture and seasons. The people of Provence developed their own distinctive culture with their own language. Provençal, related to but distinct from French, their own customs, their own way of seeing the world. When the nativity scene tradition reached this region, it was adapted to reflect Provençal character and values. The Provençal nativity scene, called a crèche, was typically much smaller and simpler than its Neapolitan counterpart. Rather than hundreds of figures in an elaborate multi-level landscape, a Provençal crèche might contain just a dozen or two figures arranged in a simple setting. But what these scenes lacked in scale and complexity, they made up for in charm and character. The figures themselves, called santons, little saints, were distinctive in style and character. The word santon reflects the Provençal attitude. Even the ordinary people in the scene were seen as having a kind of sanctity, a participation in the holy story. The figures were typically small, ranging from about 2 to 10 centimeters in height, made of clay and painted in bright, cheerful colors. The creation of santons became a specialized craft in Provence. The most famous center of production was and remains the city of Marseille, though santons were also made in Aix-en-Provence, Aubagne, and other towns. The artisans who made santons were called santonniers, and the best became well known, their work sought after by collectors. The process of creating santons was different from the elaborate Neapolitan method. Rather than building each figure individually on a wire armature, Provençal santonniers typically used molds. A master would create an original figure, sculpting it carefully in clay. From this original, a mold would be made, usually in 2 halves, that could be used to reproduce the figure multiple times. Clay pressed into the mold would take on the form and details of the original. After drying, the 2 halves would be joined, any seam marks smoothed away, and fine details refined by hand. This molding technique allowed for more consistent production, making santons more affordable and accessible. A family of modest means could acquire a set of santons and create their own crèche. The tradition became truly popular, not limited to wealthy families who could commission custom figures. After molding and firing, santons were painted with bright, clear colors. The painting style was simpler than the elaborate Neapolitan technique, but it had its own charm. Colours were pure and vivid, the blue of a woman's dress, the red of a shepherd's cap, the brown of a monk's robe. Faces were painted with simple, expressive features, dots for eyes, a line for a mouth, touches of pink for cheeks. The effect was not realistic, but stylized, almost folk art in character. What made Provençal santons particularly distinctive was their subjects. Yes, the traditional nativity characters were present: Mary, Joseph, the infant Jesus, shepherds, the three magi. But surrounding these central figures were characters drawn directly from Provençal life. There was the baker with his basket of bread, the fishwife with her catch, the farmer with his tools, the lavender seller with bundles of purple flowers, the miller with his sack of flour, the woman carrying water jugs, the old couple walking together, the blind man with his dog. Each profession and character type had its traditional costume, reflecting actual Provençal dress of the 18th and 19th centuries. The women wore long skirts and shawls, often with the distinctive Provençal coiffe. The elaborate headdress. Men wore breeches, vests, and caps. The clothing was colourful and detailed, painted to show patterns and textures. These costumes became a way of preserving and celebrating regional identity and tradition. Some santons represented specific local characters. The Ravi, the delighted one, was a figure with arms raised in joy and wonder, expressing the pure happiness of witnessing the miraculous birth. The Pistachier, the simpleton, represented innocent faith. The mayor, the priest, the gendarme, all had their place, showing that the entire community, in all its variety, was part of the story. There was also often a humorous element. The boumian, the bohemian or gypsy, might be shown stealing something. The drunk might be depicted stumbling. These touches of humor and humanity made the scenes feel alive and real, not solemn and distant. The arrangement of a Provençal crèche was typically simple. A small stable or grotto, often made of cork or papier-mâché, provided the central setting. The Holy Family was placed in the middle, with shepherds and animals nearby. The other figures were arranged around them, often in a procession moving toward the stable, each bringing their characteristic gift or product. The three magi might be placed at a distance, gradually moved closer each day, until Epiphany, when they would finally reach the stable. The landscape was suggested simply, perhaps some moss for grass, a few stones, a mirror for a pond, some dried plants for trees. The emphasis was not on creating an elaborate, realistic environment, but on the figures themselves and the story they told. Everything was scaled to fit on a table or sideboard, making it accessible for homes of any size. The tradition of creating and displaying the family crèche became an important part of Provençal Christmas celebrations. Families would carefully unpack their santons each year, perhaps adding a new figure or two. Children might help arrange the scene, learning the names and characteristics of each figure. The crèche would remain on display throughout the Christmas season, a focal point of the home's holiday decoration. In Provence, the tradition extended beyond the home. Many towns created large public crèches, sometimes with life-sized figures displayed in churches or town squares. These community displays became gathering points, places where people would come to see the scene, to pray, to share the season with neighbors. A unique Provençal tradition was the pastrage, a theatrical presentation combining the nativity story with Provençal language, music, and customs. These performances, often held in churches on Christmas Eve, featured actors in traditional costume, singing traditional songs, speaking in Provençal dialect. The pastrage was a way of making the ancient story completely local and contemporary, showing that the themes of Christmas were as relevant in Provence as in ancient Bethlehem. The santon tradition faced challenges over time. The French Revolution, with its anti-religious stance, threatened to destroy the tradition entirely. Workshops were closed, religious displays banned. But the tradition survived, kept alive by artisans who continued working in secret, by families who preserved their santons and passed them down through generations. In the 19th century, the tradition experienced a revival. New workshops opened, new artisans learned the craft. The writer, Frédéric Mistral, who worked to preserve and celebrate Provençal language and culture, championed the santon tradition as an important expression of regional identity. His efforts helped ensure that santons were seen not just as religious objects, but as cultural treasures. By the 20th century, santons had become recognized as a distinctive art form. Museums collected them, scholars studied them, tourists sought them as souvenirs of Provence. The best santonniers were celebrated as artists, their work exhibited and appreciated. Annual santon fairs, particularly the famous fair in Marseille, held each December, attracted thousands of visitors who came to see the latest creations and purchase figures for their own creches. Today, the santon tradition remains vibrant in Provence. Traditional santonniers continue using centuries-old techniques and molds, creating figures that look much as they did 200 years ago. But there is also innovation. Contemporary santonniers create new characters reflecting modern life, perhaps a tourist with a camera, a soccer player, a modern professional. These additions show that the tradition remains alive and relevant, continuing to evolve while maintaining its essential character. The beauty of the Provençal tradition lies in its accessibility and intimacy. You don't need wealth or space to create a meaningful crèche. A few simple figures arranged with care and love can be just as meaningful as the most elaborate display. The tradition says that the sacred story belongs to everyone, that it can be told in simple terms, that ordinary people and ordinary life have a place in the holy narrative. There's also something deeply appealing about the Provençal approach to representation. The santons are not trying to be realistic in the way that elaborate Neapolitan figures are. They are stylized, simplified, almost abstract. Yet they convey character and emotion effectively. The Ravi's joy is palpable, even though his face is just a few painted lines. The shepherd's devotion is clear, even though his figure is just a few centimeters tall. This simplicity allows imagination to fill in the details. A child looking at a Provençal crèche can imagine the stories of each figure, where they came from, what they're thinking, what they'll do next. The figures become starting points for narrative and imagination rather than complete, finished representations that leave nothing to the viewer's creativity. As you rest now, imagine yourself in a Provençal village on a winter evening. The sun has set behind the hills, leaving the sky painted in shades of purple and gold. You enter a small stone house, its walls thick and cool. In the corner of the main room, on a simple wooden table, is the family crèche. The santons are arranged carefully, the Holy Family in their stable, shepherds approaching with their sheep, the baker with his bread, the lavender seller with her bundles, all processing toward the center. A few candles provide gentle light, making the bright colors of the figures glow warmly. The scene is simple, unpretentious, yet somehow perfect. It tells the ancient story in a way that feels immediate and personal, connecting the sacred to the everyday, the distant past to the present moment. In this simplicity, there is a kind of peace, a sense that the essential truths don't require elaborate expression. Sometimes the simplest telling is the most profound. While many nativity scenes were designed for private homes, scaled to fit on tables or in corners of rooms, another tradition developed in parallel: the creation of monumental precipios intended for public spaces. These large-scale installations, often permanent fixtures in churches, cathedrals, and public squares, represented a different kind of ambition and required different skills. They were not intimate family devotions, but public statements, community projects, works of art meant to inspire awe and draw crowds. The creation of monumental nativity scenes required thinking on an entirely different scale. A figure that would be held in your hand in a domestic scene might be life-sized or even larger in a monumental installation. The challenges of construction, materials, and engineering multiplied accordingly. These were not projects for individual artisans working alone in small workshops, but collaborative efforts involving multiple craftsmen, significant resources, and sometimes years of work. Some of the earliest monumental precipios were created in major churches and cathedrals. These institutions had the space, the resources, and the motivation to create impressive displays that would attract pilgrims and worshippers. A magnificent nativity scene could enhance a church's reputation, draw visitors from distant regions, and serve as a powerful tool for religious education and inspiration. One approach was to create permanent installations in side chapels or specially designed spaces within the church. These might feature life-sized or near-life-sized figures, elaborately carved and painted, arranged in architectural settings of remarkable complexity. The stable might be a detailed structure with actual timber beams, stone walls, and a thatched roof. The surrounding landscape might include rocky outcrops, caves, miniature buildings representing Bethlehem, all constructed with the same attention to detail that went into the church's own architecture. The figures in these monumental scenes were often masterpieces of sculpture. Carved from wood or modelled in terracotta or plaster, they might stand 5 or 6 feet tall with faces of extraordinary expressiveness and clothing that appeared to flow and drape naturally despite being solid material. The best examples seemed almost alive, frozen in moments of action or emotion. A shepherd kneeling in wonder, a magus presenting his gift, Mary gazing at her newborn child with a mixture of joy and contemplation. Creating such figures required not just artistic skill but also technical knowledge. A life-sized wooden figure is heavy and must be constructed to support its own weight without warping or cracking. Joints must be carefully designed and reinforced. If the figure is to be clothed in actual fabric, the underlying form must be shaped to support the clothing properly. If features are to be painted, the surface must be prepared to receive and hold the paint for decades or centuries. Some monumental precipios incorporated architectural elements of breathtaking ambition. In certain Spanish and Latin American churches, entire chapels were designed as elaborate nativity scenes. The architecture itself became part of the representation, with columns, arches, and decorative elements all contributing to the overall effect. These spaces blurred the line between architecture and sculpture, creating immersive environments where visitors felt they had stepped into the scene itself. Lighting was crucial in these monumental installations. In the era before electricity, this meant careful placement of candles and oil lamps to create dramatic effects. Architects and designers learned to use light and shadow to guide the viewer's eye, to create focal points, to suggest depth and atmosphere. The central scene, the Holy Family, would be brilliantly illuminated, drawing all attention. Surrounding areas might be dimmer, with strategic points of light suggesting distant buildings or campfires. The play of candlelight on sculpted faces and draped fabric created a sense of movement and life. With the advent of electric lighting, new possibilities emerged. Hidden lights could be placed to create effects impossible with candles. Colored lights could suggest different times of day or create symbolic effects. Golden light for the divine, blue for night, warm tones for human spaces. Some installations incorporated changing lighting that evolved over time, perhaps growing brighter as viewers approached the central scene or shifting to suggest the passage from night to dawn. Beyond permanent church installations, another tradition developed: temporary monumental precipios created for public squares and civic spaces. These were often community projects, with local artisans, civic organizations, and volunteers all contributing. The creation and installation of the town's nativity scene became an annual event, anticipated and celebrated. These public praesepios varied enormously in style and ambition. Some were relatively simple, perhaps a stable structure with a dozen life-sized figures arranged in a town square. Others were extraordinarily elaborate, occupying large areas, incorporating dozens of figures, complex landscapes, architectural elements, and sophisticated lighting. The most ambitious might take weeks to construct, requiring scaffolding, cranes, and teams of workers. In some Italian towns, particularly in the south, the tradition of the presepe vivente, living nativity, developed. These were not permanent installations but performances, with townspeople taking the roles of various characters. An entire neighborhood might be transformed, with houses becoming the buildings of ancient Bethlehem, streets becoming the paths that shepherds and magi traveled. Animals were brought in, sheep, donkeys, oxen. Craftspeople demonstrated traditional trades, blacksmithing, weaving, bread-making, as they might have been practiced in ancient times. These living nativity scenes were immersive experiences. Visitors didn't just look at a scene but walked through it surrounded by sights, sounds, and smells that brought the story to life. You might hear the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, smell bread baking in a wood-fired oven, see sheep being herded through narrow streets. The line between past and present, between representation and reality, became wonderfully blurred. The organization of a living nativity required extensive planning and coordination. Roles had to be assigned, costumes created, spaces prepared, animals secured, lighting installed, safety measures implemented. It was a massive community effort, often involving hundreds of participants and volunteers. But the result was something unique and powerful, a collective act of storytelling that engaged an entire community. Some regions developed distinctive approaches to monumental praesepios. In Catalonia, the tradition of elaborate mechanical praesepios reached remarkable heights. These installations, called pesebre, might occupy entire rooms or buildings, featuring hundreds of figures and complex mechanical systems that created movement throughout the scene. Water flowed in streams and fountains, windmills turned, figures moved along tracks, shepherds processing, angels descending, craftspeople working at their trades. Day transitioned to night and back again through changing lighting. These mechanical praesepios were marvels of engineering as well as art. The creation of such complex installations required skills beyond traditional sculpture and painting. Designers needed understanding of mechanics, hydraulics, and electrical systems. They had to plan not just how things would look, but how they would move, how different elements would be coordinated, how the systems would be maintained and repaired. These were not static artworks, but dynamic, functioning machines designed to operate reliably for years. In the Czech lands, particularly in Bohemia and Moravia, the tradition of elaborate paper praesepios developed. Artisans created intricate architectural elements from paper, buildings, arches, towers, entire townscapes that could be assembled into impressive displays. These paper praesepios were often designed to be portable and collapsible, allowing them to be stored when not in use and transported to different locations. Despite being made from humble materials, the best examples were remarkably beautiful, with delicate details and sophisticated design. The architectural ambition of monumental praesepios reflected broader cultural values and aspirations. A town that created an impressive nativity scene was making a statement about its piety, its prosperity, its cultural sophistication. Churches competed to have the finest installations, knowing that a magnificent praesepio could enhance their reputation and attract visitors. Civic leaders understood that a beautiful public nativity scene contributed to community pride and identity. These monumental installations also served educational purposes. For populations that were largely illiterate, visual representations were crucial tools for religious instruction. A well-designed nativity scene could teach the story more effectively than words alone. The inclusion of multiple episodes, the Annunciation, the journey to Bethlehem, the birth, the shepherd's visit, the arrival of the Magi, sometimes even the flight to Egypt, allowed viewers to follow the entire narrative visually. Some installations included written labels or explanatory texts for those who could read, identifying characters and explaining elements of the story. These texts might be in Latin, the language of the Church, or in local vernacular languages, making the information accessible to ordinary people. The combination of visual and textual elements created a rich educational resource. The maintenance and preservation of monumental precipios presented ongoing challenges. Figures exposed to the elements in outdoor installations deteriorated over time. Paint faded, wood cracked, joints loosened. Regular maintenance was necessary to keep the installations in good condition. Some churches and towns employed specialists whose job was to care for the nativity scene, repairing damage, repainting figures, replacing worn elements. Over centuries, some monumental precipios became treasured cultural heritage. The figures and architectural elements were recognized as important artworks worthy of preservation and protection. Museums acquired examples. Scholars studied them. Restoration specialists worked to repair damage and return deteriorated pieces to their original condition. What had begun as devotional objects became recognized as significant cultural and artistic achievements. Today, the tradition of monumental nativity scenes continues in many places. Some historic installations are still displayed each year, carefully maintained and treasured. New monumental precipios are created, sometimes using traditional techniques, sometimes incorporating modern materials and technologies. LED lighting, digital controls, and contemporary materials allow for effects impossible in earlier eras, yet the fundamental purpose remains the same: to tell an ancient story in a way that engages, inspires, and moves viewers. There's something powerful about encountering a monumental nativity scene. The scale itself creates impact. Life-sized or larger figures command attention in ways that miniatures cannot. The craftsmanship visible in well-executed monumental work inspires awe. The public, communal nature of the experience creates a sense of shared participation in something larger than individual devotion. As you rest now, imagine standing in a great cathedral on a winter evening. The vast space is dim, lit only by scattered candles and the glow of stained glass windows catching the last light of day. In a side chapel, you see a glow of brighter light. You approach and find yourself before a monumental nativity scene. The figures are life-sized, carved with extraordinary skill. Mary's face shows a mixture of wonder and tenderness as she gazes at the infant in the manger. Joseph stands protectively nearby, his weathered face reflecting both exhaustion and joy. Shepherds kneel in attitudes of worship, their rough clothing and calloused hands speaking of lives of hard work. The three magi, richly dressed, present their gifts with gestures of reverence. Animals, an ox, a donkey, sheep, add warmth and life to the scene. The stable is a carefully constructed structure, its wooden beams and stone walls solid and real. Beyond, a painted backdrop suggests the landscape of Judea, distant hills, a star-filled sky, the town of Bethlehem. The lighting creates a sense of sacred space, of a moment suspended in time. You stand quietly, surrounded by other visitors, all sharing this moment of contemplation. The scene before you is both ancient and immediate, both distant and present. In this monumental representation, the story becomes real, tangible, impossible to ignore. Among the many materials used to create nativity scenes over the centuries, one of the most surprising and delicate is paper. While wood and terracotta presepios were being created in Italy and France, artisans in Central Europe, particularly in the Czech lands of Bohemia and Moravia, developed a distinctive tradition of creating elaborate nativity scenes from paper. These paper presepios, far from being simple or crude, became works of remarkable intricacy and beauty, demonstrating that artistic excellence depends not on expensive materials, but on skill, imagination, and dedication. The tradition of paper presepios emerged in the 18th century in the Czech lands, then part of the Austrian Empire. This was a region with strong Catholic traditions and a rich folk art heritage. Paper was an accessible material, far less expensive than wood or clay, making it possible for people of modest means to create their own nativity scenes. But what began as a practical solution evolved into a sophisticated art form. The earliest paper presepios were relatively simple, perhaps just flat figures cut from paper and hand-colored. But artisans quickly began to explore the material's possibilities. Paper could be cut with extraordinary precision, folded to create three-dimensional forms, layered to build up complex structures, colored and decorated with remarkable detail. In skilled hands, paper became capable of effects as impressive as any achieved in more traditional materials. The creation of a paper presepio began with design. The artisan would plan the entire scene, deciding which figures to include, how the architectural elements would be arranged, how the whole composition would fit together. This planning phase was crucial because paper, unlike clay, cannot be easily reshaped once cut. Every element had to be carefully thought through before the first cut was made. The figures themselves were typically created using a technique that combined flat and three-dimensional elements. The body might be a flat cutout, carefully drawn and colored to show clothing, features, and details. But this flat figure would be given depth through clever folding and the addition of layered elements. A cloak might be a separate piece of paper folded and attached to create the illusion of draping fabric. Arms might be separate pieces attached at the shoulders to allow positioning. The result was a figure that, while fundamentally two-dimensional, had enough depth and dimensionality to appear solid and real. The coloring of paper figures required delicate work. Some artisans used watercolors, applying thin washes of color to suggest clothing, skin tones, and details. Others used gouache or tempera for more opaque, vivid colors. The finest work showed remarkable control, with smooth gradations of tone, precise details, and careful attention to the play of light and shadow that would make flat figures appear three-dimensional. Faces were particularly challenging. On a small paper figure, the face might be just a centimeter or two in size, yet it needed to convey expression and character. Artisans developed techniques for suggesting features with minimal strokes, a curve for an eyebrow, a dot for an eye, a line for a mouth. These simple marks, carefully placed, could create surprisingly expressive faces. But the most impressive aspect of paper presepios was often the architecture. Czech artisans became masters at creating elaborate buildings, arches, towers, and entire townscapes from paper. These structures were not flat backdrops, but fully three-dimensional constructions with walls, roofs, windows, doors, and decorative details, all cut and folded from paper. The technique used was essentially architectural model making. The artisan would design each building carefully, creating patterns for walls, roofs, and other elements. These patterns would be transferred to heavy paper or thin cardboard, then carefully cut out. Tabs and flaps were incorporated into the design, allowing pieces to be folded and glued together to create stable structures. Windows might be cut out entirely or covered with translucent paper to suggest glass. Doors could be made to open. Roofs might be made of layered paper tiles, each one individually cut and attached. The level of detail in the best paper architecture was astonishing. A building might have decorative moldings around windows and doors, created by layering thin strips of paper. Roof tiles might be individually represented, hundreds of tiny pieces creating a textured surface. Stone walls might be suggested through careful painting or by embossing the paper to create texture. Wooden beams might be drawn with such precision that they appeared three-dimensional. Some paper presepios included elaborate landscape elements. Hills and rocky outcrops could be created by crumpling and shaping paper, then covering it with painted or printed surfaces to suggest terrain. Trees were made from twisted paper or wire covered with paper leaves. Fences, walls, bridges, wells, all the elements of a complete landscape could be constructed from paper. The assembly of a complete paper presepio was like constructing a miniature theatre set. The various elements, figures, buildings, landscape features, had to be arranged and secured in a way that created a coherent, visually effective composition. Some paper presepios were designed to be displayed in boxes or frames, creating a contained scene that could be viewed from the front. Others were more open, designed to be viewed from multiple angles. One advantage of paper presepios was their portability. Unlike heavy wooden or ceramic figures, paper elements were light and could be carefully packed and transported. Some designs were specifically created to be collapsible, allowing the entire scene to be disassembled and stored flat when not in use, then reassembled each Christmas season. This made paper presepios practical for families who moved frequently or had limited storage space. The tradition of paper presepios was not limited to the Czech lands. In Germany, particularly in Bavaria, similar traditions developed. German paper presepios often featured printed elements, figures, and architectural pieces printed from engraved plates, then hand-colored and assembled. This allowed for more consistent reproduction and made elaborate presepios more accessible to a wider population. Some publishers created sets of printed sheets that could be purchased, cut out, and assembled at home. These sheets included all the elements needed for a complete nativity scene, figures of various sizes, architectural elements, landscape features, even instructions for assembly. Families could purchase these sets and spend winter evenings cutting, coloring, and assembling their presepio, making the creation of the scene itself a meaningful activity. The printing of presepio elements also allowed for artistic innovation. Talented artists could create designs that were then reproduced and distributed widely. Some of these printed presepios were remarkably sophisticated, with detailed engravings that showed elaborate costumes, expressive faces, and complex architectural details. Hand-coloring these printed elements became an art in itself, with skilled colorists adding layers of watercolor to bring the black and white print to life. In Spain, particularly in Catalonia, paper presepios called pesebres de papel developed their own distinctive character. These often incorporated both flat and three-dimensional elements, with elaborate architectural backdrops and carefully arranged figures. Some Spanish paper presepios included moving elements with figures that could be made to process, or angels that descended on strings, adding a theatrical dimension to the display. The creation of paper presepios required different skills than working with wood or clay. The artisan needed steady hands for precise cutting, an understanding of how paper behaved when folded and glued, knowledge of color and painting techniques, and spatial visualization to understand how flat patterns would become three-dimensional forms. It was a craft that combined elements of drawing, painting, sculpture, and architecture. Despite their delicacy, well-made paper presepios could be remarkably durable. If stored carefully, protected from moisture and rough handling, they could last for generations. Some families treasured paper presepios that had been created by grandparents or great-grandparents, carefully preserved and displayed each Christmas season. The fragility of the material made these pieces even more precious, requiring gentle handling and careful attention. The paper presepio tradition faced challenges as industrialization and mass production changed how goods were made and consumed. Cheaply produced commercial decorations became available, and the time-intensive craft of creating paper presepios by hand seemed old-fashioned to some. But the tradition never entirely disappeared. Enthusiasts continued to practice the craft, and in recent decades there has been renewed interest in traditional paper precipios as examples of folk art and cultural heritage. Today, museums in the Czech Republic, Germany, and other countries preserve collections of historic paper precipios, recognizing them as important examples of popular religious art. Contemporary artists continue to explore the medium, sometimes using traditional techniques, sometimes incorporating modern approaches and materials. The fundamental appeal remains: the transformation of simple, humble paper into something beautiful and meaningful through skill and imagination. There's something particularly touching about paper precipios. The material itself is so ordinary, so everyday, yet in skilled hands it becomes extraordinary. The delicacy of the medium makes the achievement all the more impressive. A paper figure or building seems almost impossibly fragile, yet there it stands, carefully crafted, lovingly preserved, telling its story year after year. As you rest now, imagine a winter evening in a modest home in 19th century Bohemia. The family gathers around a table where the paper precipio has been set up. The scene is displayed in a simple wooden frame, like a miniature theatre. The figures are delicate, carefully cut and coloured by hand. The stable is an intricate paper construction with wooden beams suggested by careful painting, a thatched roof made of layered paper strips. Behind the scene, a painted backdrop shows distant hills and a star-filled sky. The whole creation is illuminated by a single candle, its flickering light making the paper figures seem almost alive, casting gentle shadows that add depth to the scene. The family sits quietly, admiring the work that represents hours of careful labor, finding beauty in these simple paper forms, connecting through this fragile creation to something timeless and profound. Among the most charming and unusual expressions of the nativity scene tradition are those created from edible materials or designed to be temporary and ephemeral. These precipios, made from gingerbread, marzipan, sugar, ice, sand, or other impermanent materials, represent a different philosophy about art and celebration. Rather than creating something meant to last for generations, these artisans embrace transience, creating beauty that would exist for only a brief time before being consumed, melting, or washing away. The tradition of edible nativity scenes has deep roots in European Christmas customs. In many cultures, special foods were prepared for the Christmas season, and the creation of these foods became an art form in itself. Gingerbread, in particular, became associated with Christmas celebrations in Germany, Scandinavia, and other northern European regions. The spicy, aromatic dough could be rolled, cut, and baked into shapes, then decorated with icing and other edible embellishments. Gingerbread houses became a beloved Christmas tradition, but some bakers took the concept further, creating entire nativity scenes from gingerbread. The stable might be constructed from gingerbread walls and roof, held together with royal icing that acted as both mortar and decoration. Figures, Mary, Joseph, the infant Jesus, shepherds, animals, the Magi, could be cut from gingerbread dough, baked, and then decorated with icing to suggest features, clothing, and details. The creation of a gingerbread precipio required both baking skills and artistic vision. The dough had to be prepared to the right consistency. Too soft and it would spread during baking, losing definition. Too stiff and it would be difficult to work with and might crack. The pieces had to be cut precisely, with consideration for how they would fit together once baked. Baking required careful attention to temperature and timing to achieve pieces that were firm enough to stand, but not so hard they became inedible. Once baked and cooled, the real artistry began. Royal icing, made from egg whites and powdered sugar, became the medium for decoration. This icing could be piped through small tips to create fine lines and details. White icing suggested clothing, halos, architectural details. Coloured icings added variety: brown for hair or wooden elements, red and blue for clothing, gold for the gifts of the Magi. Some bakers used other edible decorations: silver dragées for stars, coloured sugar for texture, small candies for embellishments. The best gingerbread precipios were remarkably detailed and beautiful. Figures might have faces with carefully piped features, clothing with decorative patterns, even tiny accessories. Buildings showed windows, doors, roof tiles, all suggested through skillful icing work. The scenes were often displayed on boards covered with powdered sugar to suggest snow, with additional gingerbread or candy elements creating a complete landscape. But gingerbread precipios were inherently temporary. The cookies would gradually become stale, the icing might crack or discolor, and traditionally after the Christmas season ended, the precipio would be dismantled and eaten, bringing the celebration to a sweet conclusion. This impermanence was not seen as a flaw but as part of the tradition's charm. The creation was an offering, a celebration, something to be enjoyed in the moment rather than preserved indefinitely. In some regions, particularly in Spain and Latin America, marzipan became the medium for edible nativity figures. Marzipan, a paste made from ground almonds and sugar, could be molded like clay, shaped into intricate forms and colored with food dyes. Spanish marzipan makers, particularly those in Toledo, became famous for their skill in creating elaborate figures and scenes. Marzipan offered certain advantages over gingerbread. It could be molded to create more three-dimensional sculptural forms. The surface could be smoothed to a fine finish. Colors could be mixed into the marzipan itself or painted on the surface. The material was also more durable than gingerbread, remaining edible for weeks or even months if stored properly. Creating marzipan figures required a sculptor's sensibility. The artisan would work the marzipan with hands and simple tools, shaping it into the desired forms. Figures might be built around small supports, toothpicks or wires, to help them maintain their shape. Details could be added by pressing in lines with tools, by attaching small pieces of differently colored marzipan, or by painting with food coloring once the basic form was complete. The finest marzipan precipios were true works of art, with figures showing remarkable detail and expressiveness. Yet like gingerbread creations, they were meant to be temporary. After being admired throughout the Christmas season, the figures would eventually be eaten, completing the cycle of creation, appreciation, and consumption. Sugarwork represented another medium for edible nativity scenes. Skilled confectioners could create elaborate structures and figures from sugar, using techniques like sugar pulling, blowing, and casting. Molten sugar could be poured into molds to create solid figures. Pulled sugar could be shaped into delicate, translucent forms. Blown sugar could create hollow spheres and other shapes. Spun sugar could suggest hair, clouds, or decorative elements. Sugar precipios were particularly impressive because of the material's translucency and ability to catch light. A sugar figure might seem to glow from within when backlit. Sugar architecture could have windows of clear sugar that actually transmitted light. The effect was magical, creating scenes that seemed ethereal and otherworldly. But sugar work was also extremely challenging and fragile. The material had to be worked at precise temperatures. Too cool, and it became brittle and unworkable. Too hot, and it could burn the artisan or lose its structure. Humidity was an enemy, causing sugar to become sticky and lose definition. Sugar creations were incredibly delicate, easily broken by the slightest impact. And of course, they were temporary, eventually dissolving or degrading. Beyond edible materials, some artisans created nativity scenes from other ephemeral substances. In northern regions, ice and snow became mediums for Christmas art. Ice sculptors carved nativity figures from blocks of ice, creating translucent sculptures that would last only as long as the weather remained cold. These ice precipios were particularly dramatic at night when illuminated from within or behind, the light glowing through the ice to create ethereal effects. Snow precipios were even more temporary. Artisans would sculpt figures from packed snow, working quickly before the material melted or the weather changed. These snow sculptures might last for days or weeks if conditions were right, but they were always at the mercy of temperature and weather. Yet their very impermanence gave them a special quality. They were gifts to the moment, celebrations of the present, reminders that beauty need not be permanent to be meaningful. In coastal regions, particularly in Spain and Latin America, the tradition of sand precipios developed. Artisans would create elaborate nativity scenes from sand, sculpting figures and architecture with remarkable detail. These sand precipios were often created on beaches or in public squares, becoming community events that drew crowds of spectators. Sand sculpture required different techniques than working with more cohesive materials. The sand had to be properly moistened. Too dry and it wouldn't hold shape, too wet and it became muddy. Artisans learned to compact the sand firmly, then carve away material to reveal forms, working from top to bottom to avoid damaging completed sections. The finest details were added last, using small tools and sometimes spray bottles to keep the sand workable. Sand precipios were inherently temporary. Wind, rain, or simply the passage of time would eventually destroy them. Yet this impermanence was part of their appeal. They were offerings to the season, celebrations that existed fully in the present moment, reminders of the transient nature of all things. The Buddhist concept of sand mandalas, intricate designs created from colored sand, then deliberately destroyed as a meditation on impermanence, finds an echo in these ephemeral Christian precipios. Both traditions embrace the idea that creating something beautiful, even knowing it will not last, is a meaningful act. The creation itself is the point, not the preservation. In some communities, the creation of ephemeral precipios became participatory events. Families might gather to bake and decorate gingerbread figures together. Communities might collaborate on large sand sculptures. These collective creative acts became as important as the final products, fostering connection, cooperation, and shared celebration. There's something deeply human about the impulse to create ephemeral art. We know it won't last, yet we invest time, skill, and care in its creation. Perhaps this reflects an understanding that not everything needs to be permanent to be valuable. Perhaps it's a way of living fully in the present, creating beauty for the moment without anxiety about preservation. Perhaps it's an acknowledgement that all things, even the most carefully preserved, are ultimately temporary. Edible precipios also created a unique form of participation. Viewers didn't just look at the creation, eventually they consumed it, literally taking it into themselves. This consumption could be seen as a form of communion, a physical participation in the celebration. The sweetness of gingerbread or marzipan became associated with the sweetness of the season, creating sensory memories that would last long after the edible creation was gone. For children, edible precipios held special appeal. The idea that something so beautiful could also be eaten added an element of delight and anticipation. Children might help create the presepio, learning baking and decorating skills while participating in the family's Christmas preparations. And when the time came to dismantle and eat the creation, it became a final celebration, a sweet ending to the season. The tradition of ephemeral precipios continues today, often in new forms. Contemporary artists create nativity scenes from unexpected materials, flowers that will wilt, ice sculptures that will melt, projections of light that exist only while the projector runs. These modern ephemeral precipios carry forward the ancient understanding that beauty and meaning don't require permanence. In our contemporary world, where so much emphasis is placed on preservation, documentation, and permanence, there's something refreshing about art that embraces transience. We photograph everything, save everything, try to make every moment last forever. But ephemeral principios remind us that some experiences are meant to be temporary, that creating something beautiful for the moment without concern for its preservation can be a profound act. As you rest now, imagine a medieval kitchen on a December evening. The air is warm from the oven and filled with the rich scent of ginger, cinnamon, and honey. On a large wooden table, a gingerbread principio is taking shape. The stable walls and roof have been baked and are now being assembled, held together with thick, white icing. Figures are arranged carefully: Mary and Joseph, shepherds with their staffs, the three magi in their decorated robes, all cut from spiced dough and decorated with piped icing. A child watches, eyes wide with wonder, occasionally allowed to add a decoration under careful supervision. The scene will be displayed for the 12 days of Christmas, admired by family and visitors, and then, on Epiphany, it will be carefully dismantled and shared, each person receiving a piece of the sweet creation. The gingerbread will be eaten, the icing dissolved on tongues, and the principio will exist only in memory. But what a sweet memory it will be, flavored with spice and sugar, warmth and love, the taste of celebration itself. When European colonizers and missionaries arrived in the Americas, they brought with them the traditions of their homelands, including the custom of creating nativity scenes. But something remarkable happened when this European tradition encountered the indigenous peoples, cultures, and artistic traditions of the New World. The nativity scene was not simply transplanted unchanged, but was transformed, adapted, and reimagined, creating new forms that blended European and indigenous elements into something unique and vibrant. The Spanish were the primary carriers of the nativity scene tradition to Latin America. Spanish missionaries, particularly Franciscans following in the footsteps of their founder, Francis of Assisi, saw the principio as a powerful tool for religious instruction. For indigenous peoples who did not read Spanish or Latin, visual representations could communicate the Christmas story in ways that words alone could not. But the missionaries quickly discovered that simply importing European-style principios was not enough. To truly reach indigenous communities, the tradition needed to be adapted to local contexts, to speak in visual languages that made sense to people whose artistic traditions were very different from European ones. Indigenous artisans, many of whom had sophisticated artistic traditions predating European contact, brought their own sensibilities to the creation of nativity scenes. They used local materials, woods native to the Americas, clays from local sources, fibers and textiles produced using traditional techniques. They incorporated design elements from their own artistic heritage, patterns, colors, stylistic approaches that reflected indigenous aesthetics rather than European ones. The result was a fascinating cultural fusion. A nativity scene created by indigenous artisans in Mexico might show the Holy Family with features and clothing that reflected indigenous appearance rather than European ideals. The stable might be replaced by a structure resembling local architecture. The landscape might show the mountains, plants, and animals of Mexico rather than the Middle Eastern setting of the original story. In Mexico, the tradition of creating principios called nacimientos became deeply embedded in Christmas celebrations. Mexican artisans developed distinctive styles that varied by region. In some areas, figures were carved from wood and painted in bright, bold colors. In others, clay was the preferred medium, with figures shaped and fired using techniques that predated Spanish arrival. One particularly Mexican element was the incorporation of local characters and scenes into the nativity. A nacimiento might include figures representing Mexican daily life, vendors selling tamales or flowers, musicians playing traditional instruments, families going about their activities. This localization made the ancient story feel immediate and relevant, showing that the sacred event was not confined to the distant past, but was present in contemporary Mexican life. The state of Oaxaca became particularly famous for its distinctive folk art principios. Oaxacan artisans created figures with a unique aesthetic, simplified forms, bold colors, expressive faces that captured character with minimal detail. These figures had a charm and vitality that was distinctly Mexican, bearing little resemblance to European nativity figures, yet conveying the story with equal or greater emotional impact. In Peru, indigenous artisans created principios that reflected Andean culture and traditions. Figures might be dressed in traditional Andean clothing, ponchos, woven textiles with distinctive patterns, hats characteristic of different regions. The setting might show the Andean landscape, mountains, llamas and alpacas instead of or alongside traditional sheep, architecture reflecting Andean building styles. Peruvian retablos, portable box altars containing religious scenes, often featured nativity themes. These retablos were typically wooden boxes that opened to reveal elaborate scenes inside with multiple levels and numerous small figures. The tradition had Spanish roots but was transformed by Peruvian artisans into something distinctively Andean, with bright colors, dense compositions, and the inclusion of local elements. In Brazil, the nativity scene tradition took on characteristics reflecting the country's diverse cultural heritage. Portuguese colonial influence, indigenous traditions, and African elements brought by enslaved peoples. Brazilian principios often featured figures with varied skin tones and features, reflecting the country's multiracial population. The settings might include Brazilian landscapes, tropical plants, local animals, architecture, reflecting Brazilian styles. The northeastern region of Brazil developed particularly distinctive folk art traditions, including unique approaches to nativity scenes. Artisans created figures from clay, wood, or even recycled materials, often with a naive, folk art aesthetic that had great charm and expressiveness. These principios reflected the lived reality of Brazilian people, making the Christmas story feel local and immediate. In the Caribbean, nativity scenes incorporated elements from the complex cultural mix of the region: Spanish, African, indigenous, and other influences. Puerto Rican nacimientos often featured figures carved from wood and painted in bright colors, arranged in settings that might include palm trees and tropical vegetation. The figures might reflect the racial diversity of the Caribbean, with varied skin tones and features. In the southwestern United States, particularly in areas with strong Spanish colonial heritage like New Mexico, distinctive nativity scene traditions developed. New Mexican nacimientos often featured figures carved from local woods like cottonwood or pine, with a simplified folk art aesthetic. The Santos tradition, the carving of religious figures, extended to nativity scenes, with local artisans creating figures that reflected both Spanish Catholic traditions and the unique character of the region. One fascinating aspect of New World principios was the incorporation of local flora and fauna. Where European nativity scenes might feature sheep, donkeys, and oxen, American versions might include llamas, alpacas, armadillos, or other local animals. Where European scenes showed Mediterranean or Northern European vegetation, American versions might feature cacti, tropical plants, or other native species. These adaptations grounded the story in local reality, making it feel less foreign and more immediate. The materials available in the Americas also influenced how nativity scenes were created. In regions where certain woods were abundant, carving became the preferred technique. In areas with good clay deposits, ceramic figures predominated. Some artisans used materials that were distinctly American. Corn husks could be fashioned into figures, gourds could become containers or architectural elements, native fibers could be woven into textiles for clothing figures. Indigenous artistic techniques were applied to nativity scene creation. Weaving traditions produced miniature textiles for clothing figures. Pottery techniques, developed over centuries, were used to create ceramic figures. Carving styles reflected indigenous sculptural traditions. The result was nativity scenes that, while depicting a story from the Christian tradition, were executed in visual languages that were distinctly American. The syncretism, the blending of different religious and cultural traditions that characterized much of Latin American Christianity, was reflected in nativity scenes. Elements from indigenous spiritual traditions might be incorporated alongside Christian symbolism. The result was complex, layered works that could be read on multiple levels, speaking to people from different cultural backgrounds. Missionaries sometimes struggled with these adaptations. Some worried that incorporating indigenous elements might dilute or distort Christian teachings. But others recognized that this cultural translation was necessary and even beneficial, allowing Christianity to take root in ways that purely European forms never could. The most successful missionary efforts were those that allowed for genuine cultural exchange rather than simple imposition of European forms. Over time, these New World nativity traditions became valued not just as religious objects, but as important expressions of cultural identity. A Mexican nacimiento, a Peruvian retablo, a Brazilian presepio, these were not just representations of a religious story, but affirmations of cultural heritage, statements of identity, celebrations of the unique character of their places of origin. The folk art presepios of Latin America began to attract attention from collectors and scholars. What had been dismissed by some as crude or primitive was recognized as having its own aesthetic value and cultural significance. Museums began collecting examples. Scholars studied the traditions, documenting techniques and regional variations. Artisans who had worked in obscurity found their work appreciated and sought after. This recognition brought both benefits and challenges. On one hand, it provided economic opportunities for artisans and helped preserve traditions that might otherwise have been lost. On the other hand, it sometimes transformed what had been living traditions into commodified folk art, created more for external markets than for local use. The most successful artisans were those who could navigate this tension, maintaining traditional techniques and meanings while also adapting to new contexts and audiences. Contemporary Latin American artisans continue to create nativity scenes using traditional techniques, but they also innovate, incorporating new materials and approaches while maintaining connections to their cultural heritage. Some create pieces that are clearly rooted in tradition, while others push boundaries, creating works that challenge conventional ideas about what a nativity scene should look like. The story of nativity scenes in the New World is ultimately a story about cultural exchange, adaptation, and creativity. It shows how a tradition can be transformed when it encounters new contexts, how it can be enriched by incorporating diverse influences, how it can become a vehicle for expressing complex cultural identities. The European nativity scene tradition was not diminished by its transformation in the Americas, but rather expanded and enriched, becoming more diverse, more vibrant, more capable of speaking to people from varied backgrounds. As you rest now, imagine a small village in the mountains of Peru. It is Christmas Eve and families are gathering in the church for midnight mass. At the front of the church is a nacimiento created by local artisans. The figures are carved from local wood and dressed in miniature versions of traditional Andean clothing, woven textiles in bright colors, ponchos, distinctive hats. Mary's face reflects indigenous features, her expression serene and gentle. Joseph stands protectively nearby, his weathered face showing both strength and tenderness. The infant Jesus lies in a manger woven from local grasses. Surrounding them are shepherds, but these are Andean shepherds with llamas and alpacas instead of sheep. The three magi approach, dressed in elaborate costumes that blend European and indigenous elements. The setting shows the Andean landscape, snow-capped mountains in the background, local plants and flowers, architecture reflecting traditional building styles. The scene is illuminated by candlelight, the warm glow making the colors of the textiles seem to shimmer. This is the ancient story, but it is also a local story, a story that belongs to this place and these people. In this Nacimiento, past and present, distant and near, European and indigenous all come together. The story has traveled across an ocean and centuries, and in this mountain village it has found a new home, a new expression, a new life. Throughout the centuries-long history of nativity scene creation, countless artisans contributed their skills, creativity, and labor to this tradition. Yet when we read historical accounts or visit museums, we find that most of the names we encounter are male. Master carvers, celebrated painters, renowned workshop owners. The historical record preserves primarily men's names and accomplishments. But this does not mean that women were absent from the tradition. Rather, their contributions were often unrecognized, unrecorded, or attributed to the male heads of workshops and families. This chapter seeks to illuminate the hidden history of women's work in creating nativity scenes, to acknowledge the artisans esquecidas, the forgotten artisans whose skills and labor were essential to the tradition. In the guild system that dominated European craft production for centuries, formal membership was typically restricted to men. A guildmaster was almost always male, and official apprenticeships were generally available only to boys and young men. This system created a historical record that emphasized male artisans while obscuring the work of women who participated in craft production in less formal, less documented ways. But the reality of workshop production was more complex than guild records suggest. Craft workshops were often family enterprises, and women in artisan families typically participated in the work. A carver's wife might prepare materials, apply base coats, or handle finishing work. A painter's daughters might mix pigments, prepare surfaces, or apply background colors. These contributions were essential to the workshop's productivity, yet they were rarely acknowledged in official records or signatures on finished works. In the creation of nativity figures, certain tasks were particularly likely to be performed by women. The sewing of miniature clothing for figures was skilled work that drew on traditional female expertise in textile arts. Creating tiny garments that fit properly, draped naturally, and showed appropriate details required understanding of both sewing and the specific demands of miniature scale. Women who had spent their lives sewing clothing for their families brought this expertise to the creation of costumes for nativity figures. The finest Neapolitan Principio figures wore elaborate costumes of real fabric, carefully sewn and fitted. While male artisans typically created the heads, hands, and structural elements of figures, women often created the clothing that completed them. A single elaborate figure might wear multiple layers, undergarments, dresses, or robes, outer garments, accessories, each piece carefully constructed. The woman who created these miniature costumes needed to understand period clothing, social distinctions reflected in dress, and the technical challenges of working at small scale. Some women became highly skilled at this specialized work, developing reputations within their communities, even if their names never appeared in official records. A workshop might be known for the quality of its figures' clothing, and locals might know that this quality was due to the skill of the master's wife or daughter, even if outsiders attributed all the work to the male workshop head. Beyond sewing, women often handled the painting and decoration of figures. While the most prestigious painting work, faces in particular, might be reserved for male masters, much of the detailed decorative work was done by women, painting the patterns on clothing, adding decorative elements, applying final touches. This meticulous work required patience, steady hands, and keen eyes. Women who had learned decorative painting through other domestic crafts brought these skills to nativity figure production. In some regions and periods, women's participation in nativity scene creation was more visible, and acknowledged. The tradition of creating paper precipios, particularly in Central Europe, seems to have involved women's work more openly. The cutting, colouring, and assembly of paper elements were tasks that could be done at home and were seen as appropriate for women. Some women became known in their communities for their skill in creating paper nativity scenes, though few of their names were preserved in historical records. The creation of edible precipios, gingerbread or marzipan nativity scenes, fell squarely within the domain of women's traditional work. Baking and confectionery were female-dominated crafts in many cultures, and the creation of elaborate gingerbread precipios drew on skills that women had developed through years of baking for their families. A woman who could create beautiful decorated cookies or cakes could apply those same skills to creating a gingerbread nativity scene. In convents, nuns created nativity scenes as part of their religious devotions and as sources of income for their communities. Convent workshops produced various religious articles, including nativity figures and scenes. The work of these religious women was somewhat more likely to be documented than that of secular women, though individual nuns' contributions were typically subsumed under the identity of the convent as a whole. Some convents became known for particular specialties. Certain orders might be renowned for their embroidery work, which could be applied to creating elaborate textile elements for nativity scenes. Others might specialize in waxwork, creating delicate figures from this challenging material. The best convent workshops produced work of remarkable quality, sought after by wealthy patrons. The work of creating nativity scenes in convents served multiple purposes. It was devotional practice, a way of meditating on the sacred story through the act of representation. It was productive labor, generating income that helped support the convent, and it was a way for women to exercise creativity and skill in an environment that offered few other outlets for these capacities. In the New World, indigenous women played crucial roles in adapting the nativity scene tradition to local contexts. Women were often the primary makers of pottery, textiles, and other crafts in indigenous societies. When these communities began creating nativity scenes, women's traditional skills were essential. An indigenous woman might create ceramic figures using techniques passed down through generations, or weave miniature textiles for clothing figures using traditional patterns and methods. The syncretism, the blending of indigenous and Christian elements that characterized Latin American nativity scenes, was often expressed through women's work. A woman might incorporate traditional weaving patterns into the clothing of nativity figures, or use pottery techniques and decorative motifs from her indigenous heritage. These subtle incorporations of indigenous elements were ways of maintaining cultural identity and tradition within the framework of the imposed Christian narrative. In domestic settings, women were typically responsible for setting up and maintaining the family nativity scene. This might seem like a minor task, but it involved aesthetic decisions about arrangement and display, practical work in unpacking, cleaning, and arranging figures, and the transmission of family traditions to the next generation. A mother teaching her daughter how to set up the family precipio was passing on not just practical knowledge, but cultural and religious values. The creation of simple home nativity scenes was often women's work. A mother might create figures for her family's precipio using whatever materials were available: cloth, paper, clay, found objects. These humble creations rarely survived or were considered worthy of preservation, yet they represented countless hours of creative labor and were meaningful to the families who used them. Women also played important roles in the commercial aspects of nativity scene production. In workshops and shops, women often handled sales, interacting with customers, understanding their needs and preferences, and matching them with appropriate products. This customer-facing work required social skills, aesthetic judgment, and business acumen, yet it was rarely recognized as skilled labor. In markets and fairs where nativity figures and accessories were sold, women were often the vendors. They might sell figures created by family workshops, or they might sell their own creations, sewn clothing, accessories, decorative elements. These women were small-scale entrepreneurs, yet their economic activity was typically invisible in official records. The historical invisibility of women's contributions to nativity scene creation reflects broader patterns of how women's work has been documented and valued. Work done in domestic settings, work that supported or completed men's work, work in crafts associated with traditional female roles, all of this was less likely to be recorded, celebrated, or remembered. The absence of women's names in historical records does not mean they were absent from the work, only that their contributions were not deemed worthy of documentation. In recent decades, scholars have worked to recover and acknowledge women's contributions to craft traditions, including nativity scene creation. By reading historical records more carefully, by paying attention to indirect evidence, by considering the practical realities of workshop production, researchers have been able to piece together a more complete picture that includes women's essential roles. Contemporary women artisans continue the tradition of creating nativity scenes, now with greater recognition and visibility. Some work in traditional styles and techniques, maintaining centuries-old practices. Others innovate, bringing contemporary perspectives and approaches to the tradition. Women artists have created nativity scenes that challenge conventional representations, that center women's experiences, that explore the story from Mary's perspective. Some contemporary women artisans explicitly honor the forgotten women who came before them. They research historical techniques, revive lost practices, and create work that acknowledges the continuity of women's creative labor across generations. Their work is both a continuation of tradition and a reclamation of a heritage that was always present but not always acknowledged. The story of women's contributions to nativity scene creation is ultimately a story about the value and visibility of women's work more broadly. It reminds us that absence from historical records does not mean absence from history. It challenges us to look beyond official documentation to understand the full reality of how things were made, who made them, and what skills and knowledge were required. It also invites us to think about how we value different kinds of work. The carving of a figure's face might be considered more skilled or important than the sewing of its clothing, but both require expertise. Both are essential to the final result. The painting of decorative elements might be seen as less prestigious than painting faces, but it requires its own particular skills and contributes significantly to the overall effect. By recognizing the full range of labor that went into creating nativity scenes, we gain a more complete and accurate understanding of the tradition. As you rest now, imagine a workshop in 18th century Naples. The master carver is at his bench, carefully shaping the head of a figure. But he is not working alone. His wife sits at a table near the window where the light is best, sewing a tiny garment from silk fabric. Her hands move with practiced precision, creating stitches so small they are almost invisible. She has been doing this work for decades, and her skill is such that collectors specifically seek figures from this workshop because of the quality of the clothing. Yet, if you asked, who made these figures, the answer would be her husband's name, not hers. Nearby, their daughter mixes pigments, preparing the paints that will bring the carved faces to life. She has learned by watching, by helping, by gradually taking on more complex tasks. One day she will be as skilled as her mother, and her work too will be essential yet invisible. The workshop produces beautiful figures that will be treasured for generations, and every one of them represents not just the master's skill, but the combined labor of the entire family. The women's contributions will not be recorded in guild registers or signed on the finished works, but without their skill and labor, these beautiful creations would not exist. In the quiet workshop, in the patient, repetitive motions of skilled hands, In the accumulated knowledge passed from mother to daughter, the tradition continues, carried forward by these artisans esquecidos, these forgotten artisans whose work was always essential, always present, even when invisible. The 19th century brought profound changes to how goods were produced, distributed, and consumed. The Industrial Revolution transformed manufacturing, introducing machines, factories, and mass production techniques that could create products faster and cheaper than traditional handcraft methods. This transformation affected virtually every aspect of material culture, including the creation of nativity scenes. The encounter between industrial production and the centuries-old tradition of handcrafted precipios created tensions, challenges, and ultimately new forms that reflected the changing world. Before industrialization, every nativity figure was unique, shaped by individual hands, reflecting the particular skills and vision of its maker. Production was slow, labor-intensive, and limited in scale. A skilled artisan might create dozens of figures in a year, perhaps a few hundred if working with assistants. This meant that elaborate nativity scenes were expensive, accessible primarily to wealthy families, churches, and institutions. Most people, if they had nativity scenes at all, owned just a few simple figures. The introduction of industrial production methods changed this reality dramatically. Molds could be created that allowed for rapid reproduction of identical figures. Casting techniques using plaster, papier-mâché, or early plastics enabled the production of thousands of figures from a single master model. Printing technologies allowed for the mass production of paper nativity scenes. Suddenly, nativity figures that once took hours to create by hand could be produced in minutes. This industrialization made nativity scenes accessible to a much broader population. Families of modest means could now afford complete sets of figures. The tradition, which had been limited by the availability and cost of handcrafted pieces, could spread more widely. Department stores began selling nativity sets during the Christmas season, making them available in cities and towns throughout Europe and the Americas. The early mass-produced figures were often of surprisingly good quality. Manufacturers understood that they were competing not just on price, but on aesthetic appeal. Master sculptors were employed to create the original models from which molds were made. These artists brought genuine skill to their work, creating figures with expressive faces, natural poses, and appropriate details. The best mass-produced figures, while lacking the unique character of handcrafted pieces, were still attractive and effective representations. Painting remained a challenge for mass production. The subtle, layered painting techniques used by traditional artisans were difficult to replicate mechanically. Early mass-produced figures were often painted by hand, though by less skilled workers using simplified techniques. A factory might employ dozens of painters, typically women and girls, who would sit at long tables painting figure after figure. Each painter might specialize in one aspect, one applying base colors, another adding details, a third finishing faces. This assembly line approach allowed for relatively rapid production while maintaining some hand-painted quality. As manufacturing techniques advanced, more of the painting process became mechanized. Spray painting could apply base colors quickly and evenly. Stencils allowed for the rapid application of patterns and details. By the early 20th century, some figures were being produced with minimal or no hand painting, using molded details and mechanical coloring techniques. The quality of these fully mechanized figures was generally lower, but they were also much cheaper, making them accessible to even the poorest families. Traditional artisans watched these developments with mixed feelings. On one hand, the popularization of nativity scenes through mass production spread the tradition and made it accessible to more people. On the other hand, industrialization threatened the livelihoods of craftspeople who had spent years mastering their skills. How could a workshop producing dozens of handcrafted figures per year compete with a factory producing thousands? Some traditional workshops closed, unable to compete with industrial production. Artisans who had learned their craft from parents and grandparents found there was no longer a market for their work. Skills that had been passed down through generations were lost, as young people chose other paths rather than entering trades that no longer seemed viable. This loss of traditional knowledge and technique was mourned by those who valued craftsmanship and cultural continuity. But not all traditional artisans disappeared. Some found ways to adapt and survive by emphasizing what made their work different from mass-produced alternatives. They marketed their pieces as authentic, handcrafted, unique, qualities that factory products, no matter how well made, could not claim. They appealed to customers who valued tradition, craftsmanship, and the connection to cultural heritage that handmade objects represented. Some regions and communities actively resisted the dominance of industrial production, working to preserve traditional craft techniques. In Naples, the artisans of Via San Gregorio Armeno continued their traditional methods, maintaining workshops that had existed for generations. They found a market among collectors, tourists, and those who wanted authentic Neapolitan principios rather than factory-made substitutes. The street became a symbol of resistance to industrialization, a place where old ways persisted in a rapidly modernizing world. In Provence, the santon makers similarly maintained their traditional techniques. The annual santon fairs became celebrations not just of the Christmas season, but of traditional craftsmanship. People came not just to buy figures, but to watch artisans at work, to connect with living traditions, to purchase objects that carried the mark of individual human skill and creativity. The santons' folk art character, their connection to regional identity, made them resistant to industrial substitution. In Latin America, indigenous and folk artisans continued creating nativity scenes using traditional materials and techniques. For these communities, the creation of nacimientos was not just about producing objects for sale, but about maintaining cultural identity and expressing spiritual beliefs. The figures they created, with their distinctive styles and incorporation of local elements, could not be meaningfully replicated by distant factories. They remained rooted in specific places, communities, and traditions. The 20th century brought new materials that further transformed nativity scene production. Plastic, in particular, revolutionized manufacturing. Plastic figures could be produced quickly and cheaply through injection molding. They were durable, lightweight, and could be made in bright, consistent colors. By mid-century, plastic nativity sets were ubiquitous, found in homes throughout the Christian world. These plastic figures represented the full industrialization of the nativity scene tradition. They bore little resemblance to the handcrafted figures of earlier centuries. They were uniform, standardized, mass-produced in the millions, yet they served the same basic purpose, allowing families to create visual representations of the Christmas story in their homes. For many people, particularly those of limited means, these inexpensive plastic sets were their only access to the tradition. Traditional artisans and cultural preservationists often viewed plastic nativity sets with disdain, seeing them as cheap, soulless substitutes for authentic craftsmanship. But this judgment perhaps missed something important. For the families who used them, these humble plastic figures could be just as meaningful as the finest handcrafted pieces. A child growing up with a simple plastic nativity set might develop the same emotional connection, the same sense of tradition and continuity as one raised with expensive artisan figures. The late 20th century saw a growing appreciation for handcrafted objects and traditional techniques. As mass production became ever more dominant, some people began to value the unique, the handmade, the traditional. This created new opportunities for artisans working in traditional ways. Collectors sought out fine handcrafted nativity figures. Museums organized exhibitions celebrating the art of the principio. Cultural organizations worked to preserve traditional techniques and support artisans who maintained them. This revival of interest in traditional craftsmanship was part of a broader cultural movement that questioned the assumptions of industrial modernity. Not everything new was necessarily better. Not everything old was obsolete. There was value in slowness, in individual craftsmanship, in the preservation of traditional knowledge and skills. The handcrafted nativity figure became a symbol of these values, a tangible connection to pre-industrial ways of making and being. Some contemporary artisans work entirely in traditional ways, using centuries-old techniques and materials, creating pieces that would be recognizable to artisans from past generations. Others blend traditional and modern approaches, using some industrial materials or tools while maintaining handcraft techniques. Still others create contemporary interpretations that honor traditional forms while incorporating modern aesthetics and sensibilities. The tension between industrial production and traditional craftsmanship continues today. Mass-produced nativity sets remain widely available and popular. But there is also a thriving market for handcrafted figures, for artisan-made precipios, for pieces that carry the mark of individual creativity and skill. The two approaches coexist, serving different needs and appealing to different values. In some ways, industrialization actually helped preserve traditional crafts by creating a contrast that made handcrafted work more visible and valued. When everything was handmade, the skill involved was perhaps taken for granted. But when mass production became the norm, handcraft became special, noteworthy, worth preserving and celebrating. The very threat that industrialization posed to traditional crafts may have helped ensure their survival by making people conscious of what might be lost. The story of nativity scenes in the industrial age is ultimately a story about change, adaptation, and the persistence of tradition. It shows how cultural practices can survive profound technological and economic transformations, sometimes by adapting, sometimes by resisting, sometimes simply by persisting in the face of forces that seem overwhelming. It reminds us that the value of objects is not determined solely by how they are made, but by what they mean to the people who use them. A mass-produced plastic figure and a handcrafted artisan piece both represent the same story, both can serve as focal points for family traditions and spiritual reflection, both can carry deep meaning. The difference lies not in which is better, but in what values and priorities they represent. Efficiency versus craftsmanship, affordability versus uniqueness, convenience versus connection to tradition. As you rest now, imagine two scenes separated by a century, but connected by the same tradition. In the first, it is 1880 and an artisan in Naples sits at his workbench, carefully carving a shepherd's face from a piece of wood. His hands move with the confidence of decades of practice. Each figure he creates is unique, shaped by his individual decisions and skills. He works slowly, completing perhaps one figure per day. His workshop has been in his family for 3 generations, and he hopes his son will continue the tradition. In the second scene, it is 1980, and a factory worker in a manufacturing facility operates a machine that produces plastic nativity figures. The machine can create hundreds of identical pieces per hour. The worker monitors the process, ensuring quality, making adjustments as needed. She has never carved wood or modeled clay, but she takes pride in her work, knowing that the figures she helps produce will bring joy to families who could never afford handcrafted pieces. Both scenes are part of the same tradition. Both represent human labor in service of the same story. The tradition has changed, adapted, survived. It continues in multiple forms, serving different needs, reflecting different values, but maintaining its essential purpose, helping people connect with an ancient story that continues to speak across the centuries. As we moved into the late 20th and early 21st centuries, something unexpected happened with the nativity scene tradition. After decades during which mass production seemed to have displaced traditional craftsmanship, and during which some predicted the tradition might fade in an increasingly secular world, there emerged instead a renaissance of interest in handcrafted precipios, traditional techniques, and the artistic possibilities of nativity representation. This contemporary revival reflects broader cultural shifts in how we value craftsmanship, authenticity, and connection to tradition. The seeds of this renaissance were planted in the 1970s and 1980s, when growing interest in folk art, cultural heritage, and traditional crafts began to reshape how people thought about handmade objects. Museums mounted exhibitions celebrating traditional nativity scenes as important examples of folk and religious art. Scholars began serious study of regional traditions, documenting techniques and histories that might otherwise have been lost. Collectors sought out fine examples of traditional work, creating a market that supported artisans working in traditional ways. This renewed attention had practical effects. Artisans who had struggled to compete with mass production found new appreciation for their work. Young people who might never have considered learning traditional crafts began apprenticing with master artisans, ensuring that techniques and knowledge would be passed to new generations. Workshops that had been on the verge of closing found renewed viability. The tradition, which had seemed endangered, showed remarkable resilience. In Naples, Via San Gregorio Armeno experienced a revival. The street, which had maintained its Precipio workshops even during difficult periods, became a celebrated destination. Visitors came from around the world to see the incredible variety and artistry of Neapolitan figures. The workshops, many still operated by families who had been making Precipios for generations, found themselves celebrated as guardians of an important cultural tradition. The street became a symbol of how traditional crafts could survive and even thrive in the modern world. Contemporary Neapolitan artisans maintain traditional techniques while also innovating. They still create figures using the traditional method: terracotta heads and limbs, wire armatures, fabric clothing, but they also create figures representing contemporary subjects, showing that the tradition remains alive and relevant. The essential techniques remain unchanged, but the subjects and interpretations evolve with the times. In Provence, the santons tradition similarly experienced renewed vitality. The annual santons fairs in Marseille and other cities attract thousands of visitors. Traditional santoniers continue using molds that may be centuries old, creating figures that look much as they did generations ago. But there are also innovations, new characters reflecting contemporary life, new interpretations of traditional subjects, new artisans bringing fresh perspectives while respecting traditional forms. The recognition of santons as important folk art has helped ensure the tradition's survival. Museums collect and display them. Cultural organizations support artisans and promote the tradition. Educational programs teach the history and techniques of santon making. What might have been lost has instead been preserved and celebrated. In Latin America, indigenous and folk art traditions of nativity scene creation have gained recognition as important expressions of cultural identity. What was once dismissed by some as primitive or crude is now appreciated as having its own aesthetic value and cultural significance. Museums and galleries exhibit Latin American nacimientos. Collectors seek out fine examples. Artisans find markets for their work both locally and internationally. This recognition has complex effects. It provides economic opportunities and helps preserve traditions. But it also sometimes transforms living traditions into commodified folk art, created more for external markets than for local use. The most successful artisans navigate this tension, maintaining connections to their cultural roots while also engaging with broader markets and audiences. Contemporary artisans working with nativity scenes span a wide spectrum of approaches. Some are deeply traditional, working in ways that would be recognizable to artisans from centuries past. They use traditional materials, follow traditional techniques, create figures in traditional styles. Their work represents continuity, a living connection to the past. Others blend traditional and contemporary approaches. They might use some traditional techniques but incorporate modern materials. They might follow traditional forms but interpret them in personal ways. They might create figures that honor tradition while also reflecting contemporary sensibilities and concerns. Still others take more radical approaches, using the nativity scene as a starting point for contemporary art that challenges conventions and explores new possibilities. These artists might create nativity scenes from unexpected materials, in unusual styles, or with interpretations that provoke thought and discussion. Their work shows that the tradition remains vital enough to support experimentation and innovation. Some contemporary artists have created nativity scenes that address social and political themes. These works use the familiar framework of the nativity story to comment on contemporary issues: poverty, displacement, social justice, environmental concerns. By placing the ancient story in contemporary contexts, these artists suggest that its themes remain relevant and urgent. The materials used by contemporary artisans range from traditional to cutting edge. Some work exclusively with wood, clay, and other materials that have been used for centuries. Others incorporate modern materials, resins, polymers, metals, glass, that allow for effects impossible with traditional materials. Some even use digital technologies, creating designs on computers that are then realized through various fabrication methods. The internet and digital technologies have transformed how artisans connect with audiences and markets. Artisans who once sold only locally or at regional fairs can now reach global audiences. They can share images of their work, tell their stories, connect directly with collectors and customers. This expanded reach has created new opportunities, but also new challenges as artisans navigate online marketplaces and digital marketing. Digital technologies have also enabled new forms of documentation and preservation. Traditional techniques that were once passed down only through direct apprenticeship can now be recorded in videos and shared widely. Rare or fragile historic precipios can be photographed and studied without risk of damage. Knowledge that might have been lost can be preserved and made accessible to future generations. Educational institutions have played important roles in the contemporary Renaissance. Some art schools and craft programs now offer instruction in traditional nativity scene creation techniques. These programs serve multiple purposes: preserving endangered skills, training new artisans, and fostering appreciation for traditional crafts among students who might otherwise never encounter them. Museums have become important sites for both preservation and innovation. Major museums hold significant collections of historic nativity scenes, making them available for study and public appreciation. Some museums mount annual exhibitions of contemporary nativity scenes, showcasing the work of living artisans and demonstrating the tradition's continued vitality. These exhibitions often attract large audiences, showing that public interest in the tradition remains strong. Cultural heritage organizations work to identify and protect important examples of nativity scene traditions. Some regional traditions have been recognized as intangible cultural heritage, worthy of special efforts at preservation and promotion. This recognition brings resources and attention that help ensure traditions continue. The contemporary Renaissance has also seen increased scholarly attention to nativity scenes. Art historians, anthropologists, folklorists, and religious studies scholars have produced substantial research on various aspects of the tradition: its history, its regional variations, its cultural meanings, its artistic techniques. This scholarship has deepened understanding and appreciation of what might otherwise be dismissed as mere craft or folk art. Interestingly, the contemporary revival of interest in handcrafted nativity scenes coincides with continued mass production of commercial sets. These two streams coexist, serving different needs and markets. Mass-produced sets remain popular and accessible, allowing anyone to participate in the tradition regardless of budget. Handcrafted artisan pieces appeal to those who value uniqueness, craftsmanship, and connection to tradition. Both have their place in the contemporary landscape. Some observers see the contemporary Renaissance as part of a broader cultural shift toward valuing authenticity, craftsmanship, and connection to tradition. In a world of mass production and digital experiences, handmade objects carry special meaning. They represent human skill, individual creativity, and tangible connection to cultural heritage. A handcrafted nativity figure is not just a representation of a religious story, but also a link to centuries of tradition, a product of human hands and imagination. The Renaissance has also been marked by increased cross-cultural exchange and appreciation. Collectors and enthusiasts from one culture seek out nativity scenes from others. A person in North America might collect Provençal santons or Neapolitan figures. Someone in Europe might seek out Latin American folk art nacimientos. This cross-cultural appreciation helps support artisans and spreads understanding of different traditions. Contemporary artisans often express deep satisfaction in their work. They speak of connection to tradition, of the pleasure of working with their hands, of the meaning they find in creating objects that will become part of family traditions. For many, creating nativity scenes is not just a livelihood, but a vocation, a way of participating in something larger than themselves. The challenges facing the tradition remain real. Each generation must decide whether to learn and continue traditional techniques. Economic pressures make it difficult for some artisans to sustain their work. Changing cultural contexts mean that the tradition must continually adapt to remain relevant. But the contemporary Renaissance suggests that the tradition has resources for meeting these challenges. What seems clear is that the nativity scene tradition, far from being a relic of the past, remains a living, evolving practice. It continues to inspire creativity, to connect people across generations and cultures, to provide ways of engaging with an ancient story that continues to resonate. The tradition has survived profound changes over its 8th century history, and the contemporary Renaissance suggests it will continue to evolve and endure. As you rest now, imagine a contemporary workshop. It might be in Naples, in Provence, in Latin America, or anywhere the tradition continues. The artisan at work might be young or old, might be continuing a family tradition, or might be the first in their family to learn this craft. They work with materials that connect them to centuries of tradition: clay, wood, fabric, paint. Their hands move with practiced skill, shaping, forming, creating. They are making something that will become part of someone's family tradition, that will help tell an ancient story in a contemporary home. In their work, past and present merge. Ancient techniques serve contemporary purposes. Traditional forms express current sensibilities. The artisan is both guardian of tradition and creative innovator, maintaining what has been while also creating what will be. In workshops around the world, in different languages and cultures, using various materials and techniques, artisans continue the work that began 8 centuries ago in a grotto in Greccio. The tradition lives, adapts, endures, carried forward by these contemporary artisans who have chosen to dedicate their skills and creativity to this ancient yet ever-new practice. We have traveled together through 8 centuries of history, following the nativity scene tradition from its origins in a simple grotto in medieval Italy to its contemporary expressions around the world. We have seen how a single idea, making an ancient story visible and tangible, evolved into countless forms, adapted to different cultures, survived profound challenges, and continues to inspire creativity and devotion today. Now, as our journey concludes, it is time to reflect on what this long history reveals about human creativity, cultural continuity, and our enduring need to make meaning through material objects. The story of nativity scenes is, at its heart, a story about the power of representation. Francis of Assisi understood something fundamental when he created that first living tableau in Greccio. We connect more deeply with stories we can experience through multiple senses. Words alone can inform and inspire, but when we can see, touch, smell, and hear a story, it becomes real in ways that abstract knowledge never achieves. This insight has driven the tradition for 8 centuries and remains relevant today. Think about how the tradition has adapted to countless different contexts. In Naples, it became elaborate and theatrical, reflecting the city's vibrant, dramatic character. In Provence, it became simple and charming, expressing regional identity through folk art. In Latin America, it blended European and indigenous elements, creating new forms that honored both traditions. In every place it traveled, the tradition was transformed by local materials, aesthetics, and cultural values. This adaptability has been key to its survival and spread. The materials used to create nativity scenes tell their own story. Wood and clay, the most ancient sculptural materials, remain central to the tradition. But artisans have also worked with paper, fabric, metal, wax, sugar, ice, sand, virtually any material that could be shaped into meaningful forms. This material diversity reflects human ingenuity and the universal impulse to create, to transform raw materials into objects of beauty and significance. The techniques developed by generations of artisans represent accumulated knowledge and skill, a master carver's understanding of how wood behaves, a ceramicist's knowledge of clay and firing, a painter's skill in creating expressive faces with minimal strokes. All of this expertise was built up gradually, passed from master to apprentice, refined through countless hours of practice. When traditional workshops close and techniques are lost, we lose not just objects but knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of generations of makers. The story of women's contributions, often unrecognized and unrecorded, reminds us that history, as written, often obscures as much as it reveals. The absence of women's names in guild records and historical documents does not mean they were absent from the work. Their skills in sewing, painting, and decorating were essential to creating the finished pieces we admire. Recovering and acknowledging these hidden contributions gives us a more complete and honest understanding of how the tradition actually functioned. The encounter between traditional craftsmanship and industrial production created tensions that continue today. Mass production made nativity scenes accessible to everyone, democratizing a tradition that had been limited by the cost and availability of handcrafted pieces. But it also threatened the livelihoods of traditional artisans and risked the loss of accumulated skills and knowledge. The contemporary Renaissance shows that both approaches can coexist, serving different needs and expressing different values. What is perhaps most remarkable about the nativity scene tradition is its persistence across centuries of profound change. The world of Francis of Assisi, medieval, agrarian, deeply religious, organized around local communities, bears little resemblance to our contemporary world of global communication, rapid technological change, and diverse belief systems. Yet the tradition he initiated continues, adapted but recognizable, still serving its essential purpose of making an ancient story present and real. This persistence suggests that the tradition responds to something fundamental in human nature. We are storytelling creatures who need to make our stories visible and tangible. We are makers who find meaning in transforming materials through skill and creativity. We are social beings who create and maintain traditions that connect us across generations. The nativity scene tradition engages all of these deep human needs and impulses. The tradition also reveals how cultural practices can carry multiple meanings simultaneously. A nativity scene is a religious object, a representation of sacred narrative, but it is also a work of art, an expression of aesthetic values and creative vision. It is a cultural artifact, reflecting the particular characteristics of its time and place of origin. It is a family heirloom carrying personal memories and emotional associations. It is a commercial product created and sold in markets. All of these dimensions coexist, and different people may emphasize different aspects. For some, the religious dimension is paramount. The nativity scene is a devotional object, a focus for prayer and spiritual reflection. Setting up the family presepio is a sacred ritual, a way of preparing spiritually for Christmas. For others, the cultural and aesthetic dimensions may be more important. They appreciate nativity scenes as examples of folk art, as expressions of regional identity, as beautiful objects worthy of collection and display. Both approaches are valid, and the tradition is rich enough to support multiple interpretations and uses. The contemporary renaissance of interest in traditional nativity scenes reflects broader cultural currents. In a world of mass production and digital experiences, handmade objects carry special significance. They represent human skill, individual creativity, and tangible connection to tradition. A handcrafted nativity figure is not just a representation, but also a link to centuries of practice, a product of accumulated knowledge and skill, a unique object shaped by particular human hands. There is also growing appreciation for the value of slowness and patience in a culture that often prizes speed and efficiency. Creating a nativity figure by hand takes time to select and prepare materials, time to shape and refine forms, time to paint and finish surfaces. This investment of time is part of what gives handcrafted objects their meaning and value. They represent not just skill, but also patience, care, and dedication. The cross-cultural exchange that characterizes the contemporary Renaissance enriches the tradition. When people from different cultures appreciate and collect each other's nativity scenes, they gain insight into different ways of seeing and representing the same story. A Neapolitan presepio, a Provençal crèche, a Latin American nacimiento, each offers a different interpretation, emphasizes different aspects, reflects different cultural values. Experiencing this diversity deepens understanding and appreciation. Looking forward, the tradition faces both challenges and opportunities. Each generation must decide whether to continue traditional techniques or let them fade. Economic pressures make it difficult for some artisans to sustain their work. Changing cultural contexts mean that traditions must continually adapt to remain relevant. But the contemporary Renaissance suggests that the tradition has resources for meeting these challenges, that it remains vital enough to inspire new generations of artisans and enthusiasts. Technology offers new possibilities for documentation, preservation, and creation. Traditional techniques can be recorded and shared widely. Rare historic pieces can be studied without risk of damage. New materials and fabrication methods allow for innovations while maintaining connections to tradition. The challenge is to use these tools in ways that enhance rather than replace traditional practices, that support rather than displace human creativity and skill. Ultimately, the 8th century history of nativity scenes teaches us about the resilience of cultural traditions, the adaptability of human creativity, and the enduring power of stories made visible and tangible. From that first night in Greccio to contemporary workshops around the world, the essential impulse remains the same: to take an ancient story and make it present, to transform materials through skill into objects of meaning and beauty, to create something that connects past and present, sacred and everyday, individual creativity and collective tradition. As you lie now, perhaps ready to drift into sleep, think about what this long journey through history reveals. Think about the countless artisans, known and unknown, who contributed their skills to this tradition. Think about the families who set up their nativity scenes each year, creating moments of connection and continuity. Think about the materials transformed by human hands: wood and clay, paper and fabric, sugar and ice, all shaped into representations of the same ancient story. Think about how a simple idea from a medieval saint became a global tradition, adapted and transformed by countless cultures, yet remaining recognizable across centuries and continents. Think about how the tradition survived challenges that might have destroyed it: religious conflicts, economic changes, technological transformations, and emerged not diminished but enriched by its encounters with change. The nativity scene tradition endures because it responds to fundamental human needs: the need to make stories tangible, the need to create beauty, the need to connect with tradition, the need to mark important moments with meaningful rituals. These needs are not confined to any particular time or culture. They are part of what it means to be human, and so the tradition continues. In workshops around the world, artisans shape materials into forms that will help tell an ancient story. In homes, families unpack their nativity scenes, continuing rituals that connect them to previous generations. In museums and galleries, historic and contemporary pieces are displayed, appreciated, studied. The story that began in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago and was first represented in Greccio 800 years ago continues to be told in countless ways, in countless places, by countless voices. As you rest now, as your breathing slows and deepens, as you feel yourself relaxing more completely, let yourself appreciate the long arc of this tradition. From a cold grotto lit by torches to contemporary workshops with electric lights, from simple carved figures to elaborate scenes with hundreds of elements, from local traditions to global exchange, the story continues, carried forward by human creativity, skill, and dedication. The artisans who work today are part of an unbroken chain stretching back centuries. The figures they create will become part of family traditions, will be unpacked and admired year after year, will perhaps be passed down to future generations. In this way, the tradition lives not just in museums and historical records, but in the ongoing life of communities and families, in the repeated rituals that mark the passage of seasons and years. And perhaps this is the most important lesson of all, that traditions survive not because they are preserved unchanged, but because they are lived, adapted, and made meaningful by each generation. The nativity scene tradition has endured for 8 centuries, not by remaining static, but by continually evolving while maintaining its essential character. It has been enriched by every culture it has touched, by every artisan who has contributed creativity and skill, by every family that has made it part of their celebrations. As you drift towards sleep now, comfortable and relaxed, let the images from this long journey accompany you. The flickering torchlight in Greccio, the busy workshops of Naples, the simple charm of Provençal santons, the vibrant colors of Latin American nacimientos, the delicate beauty of paper presepios, the sweet scent of gingerbread creations, the patient work of contemporary artisans maintaining ancient techniques. All of these images, all of these moments are part of one continuous story. The story of how humans make meaning through creativity, how we connect across time through tradition, how we transform simple materials into objects that carry profound significance. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the world, an artisan is at work, hands shaping materials, continuing a tradition that has endured for centuries and will continue into the future, carried forward by human creativity, dedication, and the enduring need to make stories visible, tangible, and real.